Hi, it's Cayman Reynolds, and welcome to tonight's live chat. We have a special guest with us. Many of you have probably heard of Dr. David Peck. He works up there with Better Be and has come to two of our Hive Life conferences and has done a really good job. And tonight's topic is going to be broad and interesting. So far, David hasn't let us down, and no pressure or anything. But we have a really important topic or two to unpack tonight, and I'm just really excited to learn about this myself. I'm really excited for you all to share in this with me, and David, thanks for coming on tonight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You're a great host digitally, you're a great host at Hive Life, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you and your viewers.
Well, I try to be, we really try to focus on nuts and bolts information because there's a lot of stuff out there that it's just hard for us to read some of those detailed PhD papers, and that's what we really like about you is we still need to understand a lot of these important laws and principles that are out there. But I think you do a really good job bridging the gap between the two, and that we appreciate that. And so we're going to be talking oxalic acid and multiple different things tonight. Lots of questions around oxalic acid extended release, the legalities, oxalic acid vapor, things that they do, things that they don't do, what we can do, what we can't do. What can you tell us about all this stuff?
Well, I guess to start, the whole thing's a mess.
No.
So to tell the truth, what you just said, the idea that not everybody can sit down and read scientific papers on this subject or that subject, it's true that it's hard to learn everything there is to know about a topic. And as a scientist, as a graduate student and then a postdoc and now in my role, I'm reading the scientific papers. I was trained to read them. I can understand them. But nobody ever trained me to understand EPA laws, and nobody ever trained me to understand, what the big commercial beekeepers are saying when they wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and say one thing and mean another one.
No, they don't do that.
But
no.
Something that I found has been pretty cool in my role here at Better Be is because I'm a scientist, scientists will tell me all their secrets. And because I'm a beekeeper, beekeepers will tell me their secrets. And because I'm not a commercial beekeeper, all of the regulators will tell me their secrets. So it's stuff that people aren't saying to each other. They're all comfortable saying to me because I'm just David, right? What's the worst I can do?
You're a double agent.
Something like that. Yeah, double, triple, quadruple. But, for me, it's mostly just I want to understand this stuff, and so I'll take all the information I can get. And so when I got sort of my introduction to oxalic acid, other than just using it in my own hives, was that somebody asked me to give a talk to the Empire State Honey Producers up here in New York, the state organization. And they said, can you just talk about these extended release oxalic acid pads? What's going on with them? What's the law say, and why does the law say it, and could the law change, and should the law change, and all of that. And that got me asking questions, and that's a dangerous thing to do, because the more questions I asked, the more answers I got, and then I had more questions. So I've sort of found myself at the middle of this complicated web of oxalic acid info, and I'm always happy to share it with people if they're willing to listen to me. So the long and short of it is there have been a lot of changes and attempted changes, and some things are permanently changed, and some things changed and then they changed back. But we know that oxalic acid is a good miticide, and we know that we need some updating to sort of what's currently legal and what the current best practices that we're educating people about are. But the process to get there has really led to me learning an awful lot about federal and state bureaucracy. Do
you need to go wash your hands after saying that, David?
Yeah. But it's tough. What I'm calling and talking to Randy Oliver about oxalic acid, experiments that he's doing. Mm-hmm. But then he's explaining to me that not only is he able to do special stuff with OA that you and I can't do in our states, he's also the only person in California who's allowed to use oxalic acid at all because it isn't legal in the state of California. So we've got all these commercial beekeepers going to Northern California almond orchards doing who knows what to their hives, but they can't even do a simple, legal, by-the-label oxalic acid vaporization because the state of California has decided that the federal EPA approving it wasn't enough. So, as I say, it's a mess.
It's a huge mess.
And it just gets more and more complicated the deeper into the onion you go.
As much as I'd love to talk about all this stuff, we can't figure out how to fix California on this conversation.
No, that'd be a much longer live stream.
Sorry, I just can't help it. Um, Here's Pierce from
Oh, there you go.
California. Thank you, Chris, for
Hey.
pulling that up. Thank you. And Anura, thanks for coming on. We appreciate your American-made products. So yeah, it's so Randy's the only guy, and just before you continue on, that one thing I'd like to point out is it's super frustrating. I think for all parties because there's several things that we all would like to see happen, and it seems like it's all tangled up and in a web. And one of the things that frustrates me is I know a guy personally who it was told that fluvalinate could work after it hadn't been used for many, many years, and then used it on a few thousand hives and literally saw no difference in mite reduction after using it. And of course, it's a lot of money still. And that is a product that we know it's not clean for the combs. It's pretty nasty
Right.
stuff.
Right.
And it can even get worse if it comes in contact with other chemicals. And so, that's legal to use. But here's something that I think is a lot more safe for the environment as it breaks down. And we can't use it in some ways. And so,
Right.
anyways, I'm jumping ahead. Sorry, David, continue.
No, you're exactly right. That you keep when you learn about sort of what's legal and what's not, and what has been and what hasn't been. You keep running into things and saying, "Really? That's not allowed, but this is." And
Yeah,
there aren't good, clear answers as to why. But it's at least useful to understand what you can and you can't currently do.
sure.
So really, the story of the whole thing starts with folks not in the United States, around the world, saying, hey, you know what? Oxalic acid, formic acid, they're these two very, very simple organic acids. It's a couple of carbons and some oxygens, and there you go. These compounds seem to kill Varroa mites, so we're going to do some tests. They very quickly got them legalized in Europe or in Canada or in the other places those folks are doing the research. And then the U.S. said, hey, we should get this for our beekeepers. So in 2015, oxalic acid was registered for use in the United States by beekeepers. And normally those registrations, because this is considered a pesticide, so it's registered by the EPA, and their job isn't to keep bees alive. Their job isn't to, regulate drugs or medicine or anything like that. Their job is just to protect the environment. That's what the EPA does.
Mm.
So they're trying to make sure that whatever drugs you're giving to your bees, pesticides you're spraying on your bees, aren't going to contaminate food that people are eating, isn't going to contaminate, water or the air or anything like that. So it's they're very, very strict. They're bureaucrats, so they've got very specific things they're testing for, but it's not necessarily how well it kills Varroa mites. They hardly care about that. They just want to make sure that it's not going to wind up contaminating anything.
Sure.
So the weird thing is that in 2015, instead of this getting registered by a pesticide company, which is normally how this happens, it was registered by the USDA. So the federal government filled out a bunch of paperwork to the other parts of the federal government and paid some fees so that they could get this stuff registered. And instead of doing all the research themselves, they actually just kept pointing to what the Canadians had done. They said the Canadians have this big old packet of data for when Canada approved it. So whenever EPA asked USDA a question, they just sort of point north and say, there you go, there's the data, that's good enough, right? It was good enough for Canada. And it got through very quickly. It was actually the fastest pesticide approval. I've been told that it's the fastest pesticide approval that's ever gone through the EPA. So that everybody was, working hard to get it through, and it only took, months and months and months. So that's how it started. But the problem is the USDA doesn't want to be in the business of selling pesticides to folks. And when they got it through sort of that initial hurdle, it then needed to get approved by all the different states. And those states, like I said, California still hasn't approved it. You've got other states that basically just say, oh, EPA says it's fine. All right, well, then we say it's fine. No problem. Other states, you've got to pay a couple $1,000s a year to renew your registration. They've got to check it and make sure nothing else has changed and pay all of their bureaucrats. So it winds up costing something like $16,000 a year just to keep a pesticide on the market. And so if you're a company who's trying to get into any of this stuff, you're going to wind up bumping into this recurring price tag, and any profit you want to make, you better be able to afford $16,000 a year on top of it just to keep that product available to beekeepers.
Wow.
So that's the way that these products get on the market, and that's true for anything. That's true for for Apivar strips. That's true for Formic Pro. All of them, they're paying these state fees in order to get this stuff approved year after year after year, even though it's already been working and already been approved. So
That is unbelievable.
that's sort of a goofy beginning of this story, and we've barely even gotten into the meat of the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's why not just put your hands on the throat of innovation? Why don't you?
Right.
Because I mean, that's before you've even gotten to the point of selling the first product. You've got this almost insurmountable
Right.
task to be able to
Right.
do that
And so
financially.
if you find somebody who says, "Hey, I grew this weird herb in my grandma's kitchen garden, and I rubbed it on a bee, and the varroa mites fell off, so now I'd like to turn that into a product," you can't just run out to the store and or run out to your packaging buddy and throw it into bottles and start selling it to people. And to some extent, that's good, right? Because if I was a chicken keeper, or if I had a dairy herd and I was going and grabbing every weird chemical I could think of and spraying it on them, there'd be a risk that some of that would get on the flowers, and then bees would go forage on it and they wind up getting poisoned. So as beekeepers, we should want the EPA to be really strict, right? We want the EPA to really care about this stuff, to not just let anybody send any chemical anywhere they want for any reason, especially in agricultural settings.
Right.
But it means that we have to deal with those same rules. And a lot of those rules are designed and written for a multi-million-dollar company that sells, veterinary, sprays, or row crop pesticides.
I think you just said it right there. The crux of the problem is the industries are really built more for the cattle industry, the corn industry, these massive industries when compared to beekeeping. And so if we're trying to play that game, we have to play at those rules. Our industry is just a fraction of the size,
Mm-hmm.
and that is part of the problem. Is we're talking. I don't know what the scale is between those industries and beekeeping, but it's tremendous.
Right. Right. And that's the danger, is that, even though we're really important to agriculture, right? We're an industry this big, but the almond industry is that big. And if there's no honeybees, the almond industry is this big.
Right.
So, we're important, but we don't necessarily have as much power as we might need to be able to go in and say, hey, either these laws don't work for us, and we need somebody to help us change them, or it means that we just bump into the bureaucrats and they say it costs $2,500 to file the paperwork. We're not going to tell you whether you did it right or wrong until you file the paperwork.
Nice.
And it's and then it'll take us 6 months to review it, and then we'll tell you that you didn't cross your T's and dot your I's correctly. So it's going to be another 6 months until we can review your next submission. So it's a frustrating system. And so one of the things that's going on with oxalic acid, one of the things that people are talking about is, there's some rumblings that maybe we don't want our bee medicines to be regulated by the EPA. So, sort of serendipitous to all of this, it turns out that the EPA and the FDA, right? So Environmental Protection Agency, Food and Drug Administration, the EPA and the FDA have been talking to each other for a long time, trying to figure out who should regulate, like flea and tick medicine that you put on your cat, right? If you put it on the back of the cat's neck, but it gets into the bloodstream, but it mostly doesn't get in, and it kills a parasite on the cat, is that a pesticide or is that a drug? And so there's been this long-standing conversation, and they're sort of getting ready to pass some products from EPA over to FDA. And the way they wrote that sort of plan was basically going to be, if it's a thing that you put on a creature to kill an external parasite, then that's going to become an FDA problem. And so that would presumably cover honeybees as well, right? This is drugs that we're putting on to the animals. So now it's not now our miticides aren't insecticides or pesticides, they're medicines. But the problem is, if you talk to a veterinarian, you talk to somebody who develops drugs, you don't want to go through the FDA if you don't want high fees and slow turnaround times and a whole bunch of bureaucracy. So, in many ways, the EPA is the easy option for us, and it's the devil we know. So there's all sorts of infrastructure. There's professors at universities who specialize in trying to help people register miticides for obscure crops, crops that don't have a big industry, like the, honeybees. But also, if I invent a new pesticide to keep figs alive, how many people are growing figs in the U.S.? Not very many. So I don't have millions of dollars, but they can sort of help you out and get that paperwork filed and get it through. So all of that exists for EPA. It doesn't exist for FDA. So on the one hand, it seems like it'd be fun. We could just waltz down to a veterinarian and say, hey, write me a prescription for whatever I want to put in my bees. But of course, you'd never find a vet who'd be willing to do that, because it's their license on the line if somebody winds up with contaminated honey, or, all your bees die or something like that. So, these sort of big bureaucratic machinations up here are going to have an impact on beekeepers. And if we hadn't been poking around and asking questions about oxalic, we wouldn't have even known that meeting was happening. We wouldn't have known that conversation about EPA, FDA, who's going to regulate what, was even going on.
Wow.
So it's it's a mess, and we might be in the best possible position as far as bureaucratic messes go. But it's certainly difficult.
What do you think of that comment there, David?
What's that? Working with a client combination patent and regulatory bring the product market. Yeah, absolutely. And there can be variations in that. You can get waivers for some of those fees. It depends on exactly what the product is, but absolutely, if they come in and they say, we want to see all of these different studies, and you've got to pay a lab, not your own lab, not a university lab, but somebody who's been certified by the federal government to do this kind of research. We want them to get 10 million lab mice and feed them little doses of this and see what percentage of them die at which toxicity level. That's going to cost you an awful lot of money.
Well, I guarantee you they're not the cheap mice that you feed your python either. There,
right. It's the fancy ones.
Yeah, they'll get the fancy government mice. You got to get that really good government cheese.
Right.
But thanks for hopping on, Humberto. Inside the Hive TV is a Humberto Bon Christiani's channel, and he has some very good videos as well.
Yep, absolutely.
So maybe this is jumping ahead of your talk, but William Kurtz says should be a difference between self-using of products or commercial. And I think, some of the countries, like I think New Zealand is one of them, where you cannot sell the stuff, but you can use it within your apiary and like with oxalic acid. And of course, the United States and New Zealand is quite a bit different in a lot of ways. But
yeah.
Kind of what are your thoughts on that, David?
So what it's called in New Zealand is an own use exemption. And the way it works is that if you're a beekeeper, you can use some of these compounds for your own use on your own bees, but you can't sell them as a ready-to-go pesticide. So if I'm Better Bee, and I am, if we had that law here, I would not be able to sell you a ready-to-go oxalic acid, glycerin, shop towel or whatever it is, fiber pad that you could then pop right open and put onto your hive. That'd be illegal still. Mm-hmm. But if I sold you a jug of glycerin and a bunch of oxalic acid and some cardboard strips or some fiber strips or whatever you were going to soak it into and an instruction sheet, that'd be fine. There'd be no problem with me selling you that and telling you what you could do. You mix it up yourself, you put it on your hives, and you keep your bees alive. It's really appealing, that idea that, yeah, sure, the big commercial guys shouldn't be allowed to do it, but hobbyists should. The problem is, for most of us, we're keeping these bees to produce a food product. Mm-hmm. And so whether you're the FDA, they're the Food and Drug Administration, we're talking about drug and medicine regulation, but the food part is pretty important here too. So if we're talking about some weird chemical I found that I'm going to put on my bees, it's going to keep them alive, it's going to kill my Varroa mites, they really want to know whether or not it's getting into the honey or into the beeswax, if somebody's making lip balm out of it. So the regulation there does make a lot of sense, and it means that at least the way that our government and our regulators currently look at this, I don't think there's any way that New Zealand framework could work here. I don't think there's any way that we could write a law that says, ignore every other thing that every other industry has to deal with. For bees, you can just buy whatever you want at the hardware store and mix it up yourself. So it's appealing, I agree, mm-hmm. but we're not there. And I don't think we're going to be able to just fix the federal government like that. So it's worthwhile for us to understand it and know what we're supposed to do and what we're not supposed to do, so that we can try to start steering those laws and those regulations towards where we really want them to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm just going to interject. And, I think a lot of people on here, and I'm sure you feel this yourself, and I definitely feel this, is a lot of a sense of frustration, because checkmate, Apistan does not work nasty stuff.
Yep.
Apivar,
Hivastan, we don't even talk about Hivastan anymore because it,
Hivastan.
right,
I forgot about that.
right. It was great.
You know,
Killed mites. It just also killed bees.
whoops. You know, a little more tweaking.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like the Apivar, at least for me and a lot of people that I know, it is just not working anymore. And also, I personally prefer something that breaks down into more natural components. That's not a synthetic. I'm not fully against synthetics. But at the same time, ultimately, we just need something that works
Right.
and multiple options that work. So we're left with primarily formic acid. I used more formic acid this spring than I've used in 21 years.
Yep.
And out of necessity, because I can't trust Apivar anymore in my own personal operation. It's not getting it done. You know, we do a lot of testing, but it's not. I mean, we're not a researcher, but we can put it in on a whole yard of bees, and at the end of it, come back and go, okay, our mite loads actually went up after using it the correct way.
Right.
And we're also having a lot of guys who are way more experienced, running a lot more hives, seeing the same thing.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, it's got to work. And so I'm left with oxalic acid vapor or oxalic acid dribble. I've got formic acid, and I've got some thiamol products, and that's basically where I'm at right now. And the problem is like when we're making nukes up and stuff like that, and dropping queen cells, I can't be putting formic on. I can't put thiamol in there. It's going to completely get that queen waxed if you
right. You want to produce the highest possible quality queen, and so you don't want to have her under chemical stress, but you also don't want her under Varroa stress or virus stress, and so it's always a big challenge there. Yeah, so that is a good point here coming up here that the new Apivar product that they're getting ready to launch, I think it should be available this summer, is going to be a different application of amitraz, but it's still going to be amitraz. And we know that amitraz is a really effective miticide if the mites aren't resistant. And we know from Frank Rynkevich's research that there are amitraz-resistant mites. That's a real thing. Mm-hmm. And if you use a whole lot of Apivar, you use a whole lot of amitraz, repeatedly, and you don't cycle between other things, that's going to make you more and more and more likely to see those resistant mites. So whether you're going to use the synthetics or not, it's important to understand that they've got to be kind of part of your cocktail, right? You know, one weapon in the arsenal that you reach for. It can't just be the end-all, be-all of everything.
Sure.
And I agree with you, too, that there is something really appealing about the organic acids, right? Formic acid, you got 2 carbons, you got a couple of oxygens, you got a couple of hydrogens. That's the end of the story. That's what it is. And formic acid, and oxalic acid, both of them, it's just carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. Formic is naturally found in honey and in honeybee venom, so it's a molecule that's kind of supposed to be there. We just put a much bigger dose of it in when we treat. Oxalic is the same thing. If you've got bees foraging on wood sorrel plants or sumac plants or, rhubarb flowers, any of those things, they're going to come home with a whole bunch of oxalic, oxalates that they're going to put into the honey. Honey's acidic, and so you'll wind up with oxalic acid there. Higher dose than what they'd find in nature, sure, but it's a molecule that, bee biology and honey biology is comfortable having within it.
Right, and I eat salads and various things and some smoothies, and I get oxalic acid in my body. It's not great to have high amounts, and I definitely don't want high amounts, but I'd rather have that in me than fluvalinate or some breakdown of fluvalinate.
I don't think that's an unreasonable position for you to take.
I think I can cleanse maybe the oxalic acid out of my system, but so we're going to jump off subject just for a second, David, and Loma Vista has a question for you about what your opinions are on the UBO, and do you mind explaining a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So UBO is unhealthy brood odor, and the current work that's being done on it is being done by Kara Wagoner and some of the folks that she's working with. So she's great. She's a researcher, but she's also started a company that is developing and selling this UBO product. So it's getting the compound that you're going to test with, and it's sort of the whole application device. So here's what it is. UBO, unhealthy brood odor, is a smell that they isolated from brood that were getting fed upon by Varroa mites. And the idea is if you take some of those smells and you spray them on a bunch of capped brood, you can check to see how hygienic your bees are being, how quickly they go, oh, I don't like that smell, better rip open all those caps. And if you figure out, if you spray that on and then go back 2 hours later and they've uncapped all of the cells, that's a pretty good indication that they're sensitive to that smell. That means that they're sensitive to some of these cues that are caused by Varroa. If you go back 2 hours later and they've opened like 2 cells, that might not be the colony you select for your queen breeding that year, because they don't seem to have that trait. So I think it's got a lot of potential. It's really exciting. The thing to remember about a UBO or about VSH queen breeding, about any of these programs, is there's a difference between the trait and the test. So UBO is a test that's figuring out whether it's just a different way of testing whether bees are sensitive to some of these smells. But if I do the Harbo assay that I know a lot of your viewers are familiar with for VSH, or if I do a UBO test using Kira's technology, I might find bees that have the exact same gene that causes the exact same behavior. Sensitive to Varroa, they're going to rip out infested pupae. It's going to reduce your Varroa reproduction. So the real question there is, which of these things is more affordable? Which of these things is more straightforward for my own queen breeding operation? If I've got 10,000 hives and I want to pick one of them to be my grafting source, then maybe I can go through and do that UBO test very quickly and figure out of all of those colonies who's doing the best. All right, perfect. Now I found my breeders for the year. If I'd rather go and do the VSH test, it might lead to the same result, or it might lead to a different one. There's another question come up here, whether this is related to uncapping, recapping. So uncapping, recapping is a behavior that's been published about. Melissa Odie and Ralph Buchler in Europe published on this. But the test there was essentially looking at survivor bees that had survived without Varroa treatment for a good long while, and figuring out, if you go in there with a razor blade and you cut off a bunch of capped brood caps and you flip them upside down and look under a microscope, you can see whether or not they have been opened up by the bees at some point and then sealed back over with wax. And so the uncapping, recapping trait was, again, it's one of these sort of Varroa resistance traits, or we think Varroa resistance traits, that we can actually test for. You go in, you look at how many cells have been recapped, and that gives you a sense of how sort of uncap happy the bees are in that hive. And the evidence seems to suggest that survivor bees that tolerate mites, are more likely to uncap and then recap their cells than the commercial bees that just get treated all the time, all year, every year, and don't have to develop any of these traits. So there's a lot of exciting stuff coming in there. None of it's solved, and none of it is going to give us 2 years of breeding program, and then we're going to have a totally mite-proof bee. We're not getting there. I don't know that I believe we'll ever get a mite-proof bee. I think we're going to get increasingly mite-resistant bees over time. But I think that things like oxalic acid, formic acid, they're going to be with us for a good long time.
So that leads me into back to where we started this. Oxalic acid, and there's a question by HD Honeybee. What about the sponges? I think that's why a lot of the people are here tonight.
Yep.
So what about the sponges, David?
So I'll start with a history lesson, and then we can talk a little bit about what we know about these sponges. So the sponges, oxalic acid is a compound. You can put it on, it kills Varroa mites. We can legally put it into our hives in 3 ways in the United States. We can vaporize, we can spray it onto packages that are ready for sale, or we can dribble it mixed with sugar syrup. That's the 3 ways we can do it. There are folks who for a long time have been doing these tests and developing these products or these protocols that allow you to put in an extended release oxalic acid product. The first product that really developed along those lines is called Aluin Cap, and it's basically a bunch of cardboard that is saturated with glycerin and oxalic acid and a few other chemicals. So it just sits in the hive. You put all those strips down in between your brood frames, and the bees and the mites are just getting slowly exposed to oxalic. Randy Oliver saw that. He thought it was cool. And he is really the one who started doing different kinds of experiments. So he started with blue shop towels. A lot of us read those blog posts with a lot of excitement. But it turns out the blue shop towels weren't really doing quite what we'd hoped. So, Randy has continued to iterate, right, to update his methods as he goes forward to try to make them work better and better. And what a lot of folks have really settled around is these Swedish sponges, which are, it's just a thing that you can get in Europe that they use instead of a paper towel or a sponge to wash your dishes. But it's basically a fibrous pad that you can soak this oxalic acid and glycerin into, and then it's going to do the same thing. It'll slowly release that oxalic acid into your hives. So Randy was publishing based on his experimental use permits what he was finding, and he was finding interesting and exciting stuff. And some other folks started illegally, without experimental use permits, doing those tests themselves, and they were reporting that they were actually having some success keeping mites under control. So what happened was the state of Vermont, the beekeepers in Vermont, and the Vermont government teamed up together, and they wrote this protocol that basically took what Randy had been talking about and said, here is something that we are going to get that we believe is legal in our state, based on our interpretation of this law that kind of governs how the EPA regulates pesticides. And so they went in and did all that paperwork, and they filed it, and there's a lot of fanfare. People got excited about that, and I was actually involved in consulting with some of the folks in New York before New York also released their own recommendations. The state of Delaware released their own recommendations, and other states, people were getting excited. So they were reaching out to their state. Their states wrote formal letters to the EPA that said, hey, we just want to check to make sure that this is all right. And then the EPA didn't do anything. They didn't say anything. They just sort of dragged their feet. I actually wound up talking to folks at the EPA, and they said, oh, yeah, well, we've written a letter, but it's in the hands of our lawyers. And the federal government lawyers, go whatever speed they decide to go. So it'll come out whenever it comes out, but I can't tell you anything until then. Sure. So we were waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and everybody was getting all excited about extended release oxalic acid pads. And then I was getting ready to stand up in front of the state apiarist in Massachusetts, Kim Skirm, and the Massachusetts Beekeepers Association. They had me there to give my lecture on extended release oxalic. And about 2 hours before I gave that lecture, I get an email from somebody forwarding me saying, oh, by the way, the EPA just told Delaware that they need to take down their recommendation. So I had a big slide that said, this is only legal currently only legal in Vermont, New York, and Delaware. And I had to go in real quick and put a big X through Delaware. Within about 48 hours, it was also rescinded in New York and in Vermont, and so it became illegal in the United States again. Or maybe it had always been illegal the whole time, and the EPA just clarified what they felt that the law meant. So it was something that each of these states legalized, essentially, and then unlegalized when the federal government told them that they disapproved.
So let me ask a question real quick. So I know California's done some weird stuff. I mean, lots of weird stuff.
Yep.
But as far as, like, you can't use oxalic acid, period, in California.
Right.
So that means basically what had to happen is the EPA said, for the United States, oxalic acid vapor and dribble and spray can be used, but then the state of California as a state was then able to say, but we're not doing this in our state. However, what was going on is basically the opposite with these other states. Is before the EPA approved anything, they were going ahead and doing it themselves, and it needed to be the EPA approved it, and then the states could pick or choose it if they wanted to do it.
Essentially, so what we're talking about is the federal federal insecticide FIFRA, Federal Insecticide and Fungicide and Rodenticide Act, the thing that governs all of this. What we're talking about is a clause in that law called FIFRA 2EE, and essentially what 2EE says is, because we know the federal government can be slow sometimes, if a state wants to approve a pesticide and it doesn't lead to an increased, level of dosage, and it doesn't lead to this, that, and the other thing, then it's allowed. You guys can do it, and then maybe the paperwork will follow up the food chain later on. And what the federal government essentially said was, this isn't an acceptable use of that because you're putting a lot more oxalic acid in each hive when you make one of these pads than you just would during a vaporization. And so they had a couple of different quibbles, but that was the main one. They basically said, you're using the loophole, but the loophole doesn't apply here. And the states went, oh, yeah, I guess it's a pretty fair point, and they took it back down.
Yeah, I see. So essentially we're back to square one.
Right. So in terms of the extended release oxalic, we are. The federal government didn't want to play any of those games. They said somebody better do the research, file the paperwork, get it through here, pay all the fees, get it approved by the
Grease some
states, and then you can
palms.
do it. Right. And so that is one legal change that happened, and very frustratingly, it happened at a similar time as another legal change with oxalic. And so it meant that a lot of people got confused because their local club basically stood up and said, "Hey, all that stuff we've been saying about oxalic that you're allowed to do, you're not allowed to anymore." And so the extended release oxalic was one thing, and that's been taken away. The other thing, though, is that the federal government has actually changed their regulation of oxalic in honey. So the FDA said, we no longer believe that there is a risk of small amounts of oxalic acid getting into honey when beekeepers are using it as a miticide. Therefore, we don't think anyone needs to test honey for oxalic residues because it is not a serious threat to human health. Therefore, there is no argument from us that it shouldn't be allowed to be used with honey supers on. And because FDA said that, EPA said, great, perfect, all right. And then the paperwork got all filed, and it took a long time, and then it got changed. So you can use oxalic acid, vaporized or dribbled, when you've got supers on your colony. But people learned that, and they learned that there was this new exciting thing about shop towels or Swedish sponges. And then the Swedish sponges became illegal, and now people are calling us and saying, well, I know we're not allowed to use it with supers on anymore, but that's not true. You are allowed to use it with supers on.
But it's,
so
it's
those
the,
are two
it's the
independent changes.
Vapor and the dribble. Okay, so
yeah,
and I know you totally understand this, but I'm just going to say it for the audience.
Please.
How ludicrous some of this is, because David, what legally I can treat my hive every single day with vaporization if I want to.
Yep.
So 30 days in a row, boom, 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 boom. 60 days in a row, whatever I want, as long as I follow the correct gram dosage,
right.
And all that stuff. And now I can do it with honey supers on too. So just I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, of course, but that's a lot of oxalic acid, and it's airborne,
right.
at least temporarily. And so that's,
right. But you can't put 50 grams of it soaked into a Swedish sponge with some glycerin that's going to slowly release small amounts of it into the hive over the course of a couple of months.
Makes too much sense. Anyways,
right.
So when it comes to the vaporization, we can use it with honey supers or dribble.
Yep.
Have they talked about the dosage anymore on
yes.
Okay.
So the dosage issue is yet another change that's needed, and it hasn't happened yet, but it is happening. So what's happening, and I'm actually pretty intimately involved in this, and I do want to say something. I really probably should have started with this. I got interested in oxalic acid because I'm a beekeeper, I am a Varroa scientist, and I am an educator. So I needed to learn this stuff so that I could answer questions like what you and your audience are asking. However, I also work at Better Bee. And because I was developing this expertise and giving these talks, when the U.S. distributor for apibioxal, which is the only legal oxalic acid available in the United States, when the U.S. distributor decided they were no longer going to carry it, the company that makes the stuff and does all of the testing and makes sure it doesn't have heavy metal contamination, lead, and things like that, they were looking for somebody to carry it, and they said, Better Bee seems like a good company, and that David guy works there. Why don't we talk to them? And so at this point, all of the apibioxal that you can buy in the United States is coming through Better Bee. So I see those crates as they come in here and go out, and we sell them to all the other distributors. The whole point of this is to get them into the hands of beekeepers, and we've actually been working with the manufacturers to bring the price down on it. So at this point, the cheapest legal miticide that you can use per hive, per dose in the U.S. is apibioxal. But apibioxal is one form of oxalic acid, and there's plenty of folks who will go, sell you on eBay, or even some less scrupulous beekeeping suppliers will sell you illegal oxalic acid and say, hey, it's more or less the same stuff. You can use this in your hives, blah 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 blah. So I do want to be upfront that I think that there is a really good reason for people to use the legal stuff and not the illegal stuff, even though
Hmm.
the illegal stuff is a little bit cheaper. But unfortunately, I wound up sort of accidentally having a financial conflict of interest to have that point.
Interesting.
So that's sort of a thing that happened, but I do want to be upfront about it.
That's what you get for trying to do stuff, David.
I know, right? The reason that I think it's important to use the legal stuff is that because it costs $16,000 a year to get each of these stupid states to approve this stuff that they've already approved the previous year, because it costs a whole bunch of money and you have to get a whole bunch of consultants. And you know what an EPA registration consultant is? It's somebody who retired from the EPA and now they make more money helping you navigate all the forms that you need to file with EPA to get something done. You need to pay all of them their fees in order to get this stuff changed. And the only way that there's a budget to do that is to buy the legal stuff so that the companies that are doing what they're supposed to do and jumping through all these stupid hoops can afford to keep jumping through the hoops. And that's the only way that we can change the law. So that is sort of my preamble to the question you got me to, which is changing the dosage. So what happened was we've got some excellent scientists around the country who are doing good research on oxalic acid's effectiveness. So you've got Cameron Jack at University of Florida, who's done and published some great research showing that when you vaporize oxalic acid at the legal dose, 1 gram per brood box, it does not control Varroa mites at the level that you might hope. However, if you do 2 grams per brood box or 3 grams or 4 grams per brood box, you get better Varroa control. And so he published that paper, and he said, we need to update this. And as we've already discussed, changing these laws and these rules is not something that you just do right away. Other folks, Jennifer Berry, working with Keith Delaplane, and then Lewis Bartlett at University of Georgia, all great scientists, great beekeepers. They also have got data that show that when you do these low dose, or rather these legal dose treatments, 1 gram per brood box, you're not going to get as good control as when you maybe double that. Mm-hmm. And so based on those data, I am actually working with the manufacturer because Better Bee is the distributor, and we're in the U.S., so I understand this better than they do. I am helping them actually draft that language right now, and we're filing the paperwork so that we can get that dosage bumped up per brood box. But just because the scientists have already published the papers that showed that the higher doses is better, that doesn't satisfy EPA. Because remember, they don't care about whether this kills mites or not. EPA only cares about, is it going to contaminate drinking water? Is it going to poison somebody? Is it going to contaminate the air? Is it going to kill a bird? Those are the real big checks that EPA worries about.
Well, my truck hit a bird on the way home today, so
well, don't let EPA hear about
it. Don't let the EPA hear that. Oh gosh, I hate it too. It looked like a pretty one, but it ran right in front of me.
Yeah.
But right, and contamination of honey, and of course we do want our food safe. We do.
Yeah.
But there also has to be there should be this high level of scrutiny to make sure that the standard is high and everything is safe. But when things there's some common sense and there's some healthy research behind it, it seems like it shouldn't be this ridiculous to get things done.
Personally, as a taxpayer of the United States, I wish the government made this a little bit cheaper and easier to update. Once you've proven the safety, once you've proven the efficacy, it shouldn't be as hard as it seems to be. That being said, it's happening. Mm-hmm. We're doing it. Legally, I mm-hmm. cannot tell you to use 2 grams per brood box today. But I can tell you that I am working with the relevant people to file the paperwork, and hopefully EPA is going to approve that 2 grams per brood box dosage when we get it through to them. And that's going to match what the Canadians and what the EU have already approved. And it's not like Canada and the EU don't have their own regulators and their own environmental protections. But the paperwork's gone through them. It hasn't gone through us yet because there were some delays based on even more bureaucracy than I want to talk about tonight that delayed sort of getting some of the stuff filed properly.
So I need to say a quick thank you to Dave Dwyer and to Paul Martins for yet again supporting our channel. We appreciate you guys so much. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Paul Martins. You guys have been able to help us build this and be able to continually bring guys like David on. And of course, that morphed into Hive Life. And so, you guys have really been a huge part of making what goes on happen. And thank you very much. We've got some questions for you, David. And personally, I just want to say thanks for doing all of this crazy stuff. In order to get anything done,
apparently somebody's got to do it.
Somebody's got to do it. Might as well be you, and you're crazy enough to actually do it. And that's the thing, though. I mean, we need somebody to fight these battles, and it takes two things that it's going to happen. First thing is you're going to have to deal with a lot of crap that you never would have wanted to. And that's the nature of going into trying to create change. And the other thing is there's going to be some scrutiny that comes with it too. And I've heard people even throw shade at you, Dave, and I said there's no grounds on that. Just because he works for Better Be. I personally don't think that matters at all. Because I personally look at everybody like it's merit based. Yeah, I think that's how we all want to be treated, merit based. Can you do something? Can you not do something? Titles, skin color, none of that really matters. Sex, it shouldn't apply into those things. It's can you get it done? Period. Right. And of course, doing Hive Life, I've come into a fair bit of scrutiny myself, and But hey, just think of all the fun we're having. So, getting into some of these questions.
Yeah, sure.
Here's one right here. Does the mineral oil treatment even remotely work? And I'm pretty sure that relates to mineral oil fogging.
I have done my best to try to find good evidence on mineral fog as an effective miticide. And all of the evidence I've been able to find suggests that it is not effective. It is not, any effectiveness that it has is probably not it's not being caused by what people think it's being caused by. You run the risk of damaging, if you're doing mineral oil with oxalic acid, then you're going to wind up breaking apart a lot of that oxalic acid dihydrate. You're actually breaking the molecules into different compounds, which sure can have mitocidal effects, but that's not really what you wanted to do in the first place. Some of it is also just that the mineral oil itself seems to knock a few mites loose. And, if I take 40 pounds of powdered sugar and I pour it onto a hive, I'm going to knock some Varroa mites down. That doesn't mean that it's a good, effective, or recommended mite control.
It used to be pretty well held in a lot of bee clubs. That
right.
Back when I got into beekeeping, I mean, everybody was getting that powdered sugar, and I did it for a few years, and we'd have bees flying through the bee yard. They looked like ghosts. They just be so white with the powder. They couldn't hardly see anything, and it did knock some mites down. But it didn't work near as good as the oxalic acid vapor does. Right. And all you have to do, if anyone wants to this is you going out there and doing some tests yourself. If you ever get a hive with high mite loads and you want to learn something from it and you're willing to take the time to do it, do oxalic acid vapor and treat once and then come back about 4 days later and treat again and have a sticky board underneath and count the mites and then do that for 8 to 10 rounds, and you will see that it's not near as effective as what most people are telling you that oxalic acid vapor is. And my thoughts on the mineral oil and any of these additives to it is even if it does kill some mites, you're losing some concentration there, and we know that the vapor is the best version of it right now, just the pure form of it, and it's not enough as it is. It's not enough.
Right. And I think the other thing too is to some extent when you find somebody advocating for the mineral foggers, I think a lot of people sunk a few $100s into a mineral oil fogger, didn't find that it worked very well, but they don't want to feel silly, so they have to make it work.
Sure.
And so I think that some of those testimonials you get are a little bit too emphatic. It doesn't quite feel like data. It feels like someone trying to convince themselves that it's really working for them.
And I'm going to throw YouTubers under the bus a little bit here because we have to be held accountable to a degree, but we're not very we're not held accountable really. The only people that right now that I know that can hold us accountable as each other on YouTube.
Hmm.
And we have some of the old guard who heavily promote it. I know two very popular beekeepers who are quite large that were pushing that and have millions of views on those things. And just
Hmm.
because a YouTuber does it does not mean that it's worth anything. It actually could be them having you go through their link to get it and them getting 4% off of everyone purchased. And if they
Hmm.
sell 1,000 of them, well, somebody's making some cheddar, and maybe they don't care if your bees survive or not.
Right.
So I want to say thanks, Mr. Turtle. Very appreciative, and all the money that we raised tonight, that's going to be going to David. He hasn't asked for it, but we do really appreciate him. And so everyone, I appreciate you donating tonight. That's going to help him continue to do all this stressful crap that I don't want to have to do. Um, Ian's like, who? It's mostly the Canadians' fault. It's definitely the Canadians' fault.
Well, if it wasn't
Roger,
the Canadians, we wouldn't even have oxalic acid legal in the
I
U.S.
know, I
So we
know,
better be
but
nice to them.
we got to be nice. Not that I'm afraid of what they're going to do to us or anything. Um, okay, too much shade. Roger Tyson, can Varroa become resistant to oxalic acid?
So it's a hard one for me to answer because, on the one hand, as an evolutionary biologist, I'm never going to say that a parasite can't become resistant to something, right? If you had a billion Varroa mites in front of you and you squirted oxalic acid at all of them, if any one of them had any trick up their sleeve that helped them to survive it, then that's going to be the ones that are the parents of the next generation. And if their kids inherit that same thing, sure, it can happen, it can spread. That being said, I don't know of any mechanism that would allow a varroa mite to easily become resistant to OA. None of my understanding of how oxalic acid works against varroa mites and my understanding of mite biology, sort of which protein pumps they could even have a mutation in that might potentially give them resistance,
Mm-hmm.
none of that suggests that there's any real likelihood of it happening. I've never once heard anyone suggest that they had oxalic resistant mites. Um, I can't and won't rule it out, but it is something that does not keep me up at night. Things like synthetic miticides, absolutely, right? We saw it with Apistan, we saw it with Coumaphos. We are absolutely seeing that some beet mites, not all of them, but some mites are Apistan or Amitraz resistant. And so, we need to change up our game there. We're not seeing the same thing with the organic acids or with the thymol-based products, Apolate Var or Apigard.
Apigard.
And so,
Everything sounds the same.
oh, it's so frustrating. The names drive me crazy.
It is apabioxal, ape of this. And so,
Right.
for those of you who are wondering which ones that the mites have developed immunity to, that would be Apistan, Czech mite, and some cases Apivar. Um, and it's super frustrating. As far as the oxalic acid goes, I think that's one of the things that the treatment-free beekeepers push heavily as part of their argument. And I'm not trying to pick on them, but they have to have some things to hang on to in order to make their points. And I think one of the things that they do is they point that they've gotten resistant to these synthetics. They could get resistant to anything, and I disagree with that because nothing out there is. Everything has a weakness, is the way I look at it. And I think if you look at it from whether if it's an evolutionary standpoint or a creation standpoint, whichever way you look at it, nothing can be immune to literally everything. And so there's everything's got an Achilles heel, and you have just as good a likelihood of evolving or whatever to it as going extinct, and that is a legitimate possibility too. And so I think that's part of the argument with that whole resistant thing that kind of gets lost in it that there is a possibility that no, you might just go extinct,
Right.
as opposed to developing resistant to it. So far there's not a natural acid that the mites have developed any resistance to that we've seen thus far.
None that I know of. Nothing that's ever been used as a miticide, right? Honeybee or honey is a very mild acid. It's mildly acidic, and they're not, they're not getting killed by that. But anything that's ever been used as a miticide, no, there's been absolutely no research suggesting resistance to it
So going
that
along
I've seen.
those lines, Travis Hansen, watch out for lurking Canadians. I could say something, I'm not going to. Stuart Campbell, thank you once again for supporting us and talking of crazy beekeepers. I'm out doing oxalic acid vapors right now at 1:30 a.m. here in Scotland. Man, us beekeepers are some of the most hardcore people that I know. 1:30 a.m. listening to us and treating with oxalic acid vapor. Kudos to you, Stuart. Kill a few more for David and I, please.
Don't kill
So
them all, because then I won't have anything to study or talk about.
that's right.
Just kill most of them.
You just fly out here and kill all of mine. Travis Hansen, any opinion on spraying 18% lactic acid? Lactic that's not even illegal in the U.S., is it?
That's correct. But none of these things were legal until they were. So if you had an experimental use permit and you were collecting good data and you were trying another organic acid like lactic acid, citric acid, any of those things, and you were documenting that it was working, I would be really excited to talk to you. I haven't talked to anybody who's been testing lactic acid, but we have to be careful about the line we're walking here. On the one hand, beekeepers should be using legal miticides. There are plenty of them. They work well. You can use them in concert with each other. There's room for improvement. We're trying to change some of these labels. There's, potentially new things being developed. And as long as you're doing that the right way and you go through all of these annoying hurdles to get it approved, yes, those are good, miticides as well. We can't rule out that there's good miticides that we just haven't discovered or done that research and all that paperwork on.
Mm-hmm.
However, jumping in and just doing that, everybody going out in their backyard and trying to whip something up and spraying it on their bees or fogging it on their bees or what have you, turns beekeepers into scofflaws. And there's two huge dangers there. One of them is we take away that good old capitalistic market force that encourages companies to keep developing legal miticides. And if every miticide that we're using is illegal and all of our methods are illegal, it means when you go to your local university and you talk to your state honeybee education person and you ask them questions, they can't legally give you answers. Because if somebody doesn't do all this annoying paperwork, then they aren't allowed to stand up there and say, yeah, here's what we find the extended release oxalic acid pads are doing. Here's what we found that lactic acid was doing. So we've got to jump through those hoops, and so somebody's got to foot the bill, and it really ought to be folks who are keeping their bees alive because of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of it, the other much bigger danger for us is if beekeepers get a reputation for spraying any old chemical we can find into our hives, we are not going to have the same market for our beeswax and for our honey that we currently have. Right? You've got a lot of folks who will buy beeswax to make candles, even though they could get paraffin wax or soy wax or all kinds of other waxes for a lot cheaper, because they're saying, hey, this stuff's purer than any other source of wax on the market. But if we go in there and we test it and we find, lactic acid and, peppermint oil and all kinds of goofy stuff that beekeepers have been putting in, if they detect that and say, hey, this isn't as pure as I thought, they're suddenly going to start saying, well, maybe I should just buy organic soy wax instead. And there went the entire cosmetics and candle wax market.
I think
same thing's true for honey.
I think another thing going along those lines is if we get a reputation for it being, just real flippant with anything that we throw in the hives, how are we going to have a legitimate argument to keep the regulations on what sprays are being applied into fields? Because that's one of the arguments that I've heard from farmers, like, well, if beekeepers are using a tactic, commercial beekeepers throwing that in and making their own amatraz stuff, why can't we mix and match our own sprays for our crops to help us out?
Right.
Even if that's toxic to honeybees and stuff like that. So I think it's got to be I think the biggest problem, or maybe the solution that we need a little more capitalism and to putting some money into the right places. The problem is we don't really know always as a community what are the right places. And I also think maybe this is as important as anything, is we need good representation. And I don't think we have a good focused, I don't think the beekeeping community has done itself any favors by being as disorganized as we are.
Yep.
And so we have a lot of different people wanting stuff, but there's not a laser focus on our needs. And so we're not getting anywhere. And so honestly, I don't know if this will actually happen, but that is something that we desire to do at Hive Life, is to be able to, maybe we don't do it, but if we can find the right people or work with those people, and either whether it's financially or whatever, we want to see this happen and in any way. So
endorse some of those directions that are actually going to take the industry where we need to go instead of just sort of milling around and arguing with each other.
absolutely. Well, I mean, we need stuff ourselves. We've got hundreds of hives, and we have to have options. And the options that work now might not work 10 years from now. Or if they do work now, I don't think formic acid's going away, but maybe a better delivery of formic acid or multiple
Sure.
different deliveries. Um, so Luke says, I wish EPA would just throw us a little OA bone. I kind of wish they do too. But the EPA is not known for being super agreeable to work with. I've been hearing that from my grandpa since I was like 5 years old.
Yep.
And he
Yep.
wasn't wrong. And now here I'm an adult and I'm like, this is what he was talking about. I want to say a big thank you to Russell Koopman. Thanks, Russell. I don't remember which subscriber count you were, but I know you've been here a super long time. We appreciate your continued support and look forward to seeing you in the future. And I also want to say a big thanks to Ian Stepler sending us those Canadian dollars. As much as we pick on our cousins over the state or the country lines, we do appreciate a lot of the research and beekeepers that come out of Canada, and Ian is definitely one of them.
Yep.
Even if he talks a little funny. So getting back to the oxalic acid vapor, so you think that we're going to be able to eventually have increased dosages?
Yes.
And I mean, do we even have a remote timeline on that? I know it's hard to say, but
My best understanding is that, I mean, nothing goes fast at EPA. My best understanding is that I wouldn't expect it this year, and I think that if we get all our ducks in a row and we're organized and we do work with them, and we say EPA ought to throw us a bone, and they don't. They're doing their job. They're following the law. They're bureaucrats. They're not going to stick their neck out for anybody.
sure.
But they're not out to get us. Right? EPA is trying to keep farmers from spraying illegal pesticides and fungicides that kill bees. So we like a lot of what they do. It's just that we don't like jumping through the same hoops. But as you say, it's more us being hypocrites than them being really, really obstinate about it. Even
Sure.
though there's places I might improve the system. I think potentially by next beekeeping season in the U.S., we could find ourselves under a regimen of higher legal vaporized dosage.
And are we talking like do we know at this point if it's a jump from 1 to 2, or are we trying to get more than that? Or are they going
So
to?
I'm
We're,
working with the scientists there and trying to figure out exactly what to aim for. And part of the problem is, again, the research we have tells us we need to change something, but it doesn't tell us exactly what the change should be. So Cameron Jack did some great research, and he showed that 4 grams of oxalic acid on a hive was giving better mite control than 1. But the problem is he was only using single deep brood boxes. So he's talking about a 4, a times 4 increase. But when you do the same research on double deeps and you go from just 1 gram to 2 grams, 1 gram per brood box to 2 grams per brood box, that's still 4 grams being added. So do we need 4 grams total per colony, or do we need 4 grams per brood box? So I'm currently talking to the scientists and sort of forcing them to go back to their lab notebooks and find the numbers so that we can try to figure out what we should even be asking for, what we even think is going to be most effective. And so we're trying to figure out exactly what that number is going to be. It's going to be north of 2. It's going to be 2 or higher. It's not going to be 12 grams per brood box, right? And that's the other danger here, because if we don't change the law, if we've got scientists doing the science, but we don't have the paperwork getting filed and the federal government allowing the law to be changed, it means that, I tell you that Cameron said that 4 grams works better. So you use 4 grams and you tell your buddy, and your buddy says, okay, well, I'm going to use 8 grams because I want to have fewer mites than Cayman. And then his buddy says, well, I'm going to do 16 grams. Now, suddenly we're going to wind up, smoking our bees because we have, deviated from the actual research because we don't have really clear guidance about what is and isn't safe.
So I've got something to add on that. So
Yeah.
we tested some stuff out last year, and last year, before all this got shut down, we had for Tennessee EPA exemption to test the sponges, and we did, and it wasn't really anything groundbreaking, and we found that over the period of time that we tested them, it was like a 40% reduction over that time versus the control group. So instead of the mites basically going like this, like they normally do, they were going at a little bit less of an angle, but they were still growing.
They still increase.
They still increased. It definitely made a difference, but it's not this massive knockback treatment.
Right.
So, of course, anything new, it's exciting for me. It's exciting for everybody. When you see something new, you hope that this is going to make things easier or better. Realistically, though, it's not even a knockback treatment. It would be something that would supplement what you're already doing.
Right.
So for those of you who are listening, the oxalic acid sponges would not really be as earth-shattering as a lot of people make it out to be.
It's not a silver bullet. It's not a miracle cure for Varroa mites. It's just another management technique and another management tool that may very well wind up getting legalized in the United States through the proper channels. But you're exactly right. All of the research tells us that if you've got high Varroa mites and you use an extended release pad, you're probably going to have your bees die from Varroa. But if you've got low Varroa mites and you want to keep them relatively low for a long time, then those extended release pads do reduce the mite growth. And that's a really useful tool, especially for somebody like you, right? So I'm in upstate New York. I'm not that far away from Canada where Formic Pro is manufactured. So in Toronto or in upstate New York, when I use formic acid, I've got a whole bunch of time throughout the summer where the weather is perfectly suitable for me to use that under 85 degrees Fahrenheit. But further south you go, there's a whole bunch of the summer where the idea of being under 85 for any extended period of time
is a blessing from God whenever that happens.
Right, if it ever happened. And so that's once again, it's those darn Canadians, right? Is they've developed a product that works for them, but that's the formulation that we have. So if you're in the South, if you're in Florida and you want to use formic to keep your mites down, well, you can't use it for the next 2 months. But if you put an extended release oxalic acid pad on, maybe that's going to help keep those mite levels low long enough for the weather to cool down, and you can go in and put that formic pad on. So it's all about using these things in a smart way together. And the more weapons we have, the better. Right, exactly. Yeah, it's why I can't just call somebody or sit right here and say, here's what you should do to keep your Varroa mites under control, period, end of story. You've got to keep your eye on them, and you've got to, if you're up here, if you're down there, if you've got new colonies that you just started or old overwintered colonies, it's all going to be different. But if you know what each of these tools does, and if we keep adding new weapons to that arsenal, we're just going to become more effective at controlling them.
I like the way you said weapons. Of course, I'm in Tennessee, though. We like that kind of stuff.
You like anytime anybody says weapons.
That's right. More firepower. That's right. So when it comes to the oxalic acid and it comes to all of these, one of the things I want to jump into is what we have available now and how to make them effective as best as we know how. And before we jump into that, we tested out the sponges. That's what we found on those. That was just our, we were only testing. We had 4 groups of 13. One of the other groups was oxalic acid vapor, and we did 4 grams per brood chamber, and so they were all double deeps. So that was 8 grams. Now I did 5 rounds in 15 days, and the reason for that is, as you know, the brood's only capped for a short period of time. It's not even 2 full weeks that it's in a capped stage.
Right.
So if we really hammer that period, and we hammer it at the beginning, so we get almost everything that is on the bees, which most people know that as phoretic, even though it's not quite correct. We're just gonna call it phoretic, though.
Right.
So we hammer those that are on the bees, and now we have to cover an emerging period of about a little under 14 days. So in 15 days, we did 5 rounds of 8 grams per hive. We saw in every colony major disruption of brood patterns. I mean, these were good-looking colonies, strong, healthy, really good patterns, shotgun patterns. That's what we experienced afterwards. I wasn't sure they were going to recover from it, and it took about almost 2 brood cycles for it to clean up. And so the oxalic acid at a very high dosage at that big a frequency did have some negative effects on the colonies. I will say, though, they overwintered as good as anything else in the group did. The control group, we lost almost all of them. The mite loads were just phenomenally high. at the end of the test period. The sponges was the second highest loss group. We lost a lot of the colonies from there. Even though we tried to clean them up afterwards with another product afterwards, the damage was already done by when we ended the test in late September. Thymol was the second best in survivability, and the oxalic acid vapor at that high dose actually ended up being right there neck and neck with Thymol on survivability. So oxalic acid vapor is not a perfect treatment. Absolutely not.
And none of them are. There's costs to all of them. You know, the formic acid, if you read the Formic Pro label, it tells you that you should be treating for a 2-week period. But the formic acid only comes out and kills mites for a period of maybe 48 hours, 72 hours. The rest of that 2-week period is just to keep you from messing around in your bees and noticing that it killed a whole bunch of brood, and then watching as the bees scoop all that brood out, and then the queen starts laying again, and then they get it all replaced. So it's not therapeutic. It's just because it's sort of emotionally upsetting to learn that this really, really effective miticide also killed some brood. And it's fine. It's healthy for your colony to go through that, because the loss, the chemical stress of going through a formic or a high dose oxalic or whatever these treatments are is worth it compared to that growing and growing and growing lingering mite and virus pressure that's going to knock them over during the middle of winter.
So there was a question up above, and I think you kind of answered it before, but just real quick, let's kind of reiterate it again. Roger Tyson has a question. Do we know if there's still a push to approve extended release oxalic acid, or is it dead in the water?
So the method that everyone was trying to use of getting each state to approve it is over. There is one weird side channel that is currently bubbling along in the background, and I'm keeping my finger on that pulse, where it turns out that there's another loophole in the federal law that the EPA uses to regulate this stuff. It's I got it written down. I think it's 22C, 24C. Sorry about that. Which is the special local need exemption. And so there's some folks in Alaska who are trying to argue that because Alaska is weird, basically, they got crazy climate, crazy summer, crazy winter, they said, because we're so weird, we should be allowed to use these oxalic acid pads even though nobody else can. And so they're trying to push that through. Who knows if that'll fly or not.
I think it's so cold up there and so weird.
Right.
I mean, that's almost a legitimate complaint right there.
It's hard to argue with. But at the same time now, if you're in Florida or you're in Georgia or you're in Tennessee or you're in Texas and you say to me, you know, I want to use these extended pads, and I'm the federal government, and I say, no, you've got all these good miticides. You've got Apivar, you've got Formic, you've got this, you've got that. And if you said, yeah, but the Apivar is starting to show some signs of resistance, and the Formic I can't use because we're in the South. So our special local need of everybody south of the Mason-Dixon line is that we need stuff we can use in the summer, and so we should be allowed to use it. So then maybe you guys all get it, but us up in the north have to come up with our own special local need.
You Yankees are on your own.
I'm not sure that that's going to be the way to do this, and I'm not sure it's going to work. I can promise you that the EPA will grumble about it if that's what folks try to pursue, but I don't think that's the path forward. I do know that there are some companies who are looking at pushing extended release oxalic acid products through the actual pipeline. And there's a few people I've talked to, and I don't think they've got the oomph that they need to really push it through. There's another project that I'm aware of that I think potentially we could be getting there. They could be filing that paperwork, and we could see an extended release oxalic product on the market. But I think it's going to have to come out through the official regulated channels. And unfortunately, it means it's going to cost money. And I know that beekeepers think that we're getting gouged on some of those prices, right? Some of it, these companies are making money. But on the same, by the same token, every one of these miticides, they're paying each of those states thousands of dollars to try to get those approvals every year.
So I did the math on that. If it's $16,000 a state per year, that's $800,000.
It's about $16,000 total.
Okay,
but that's not
state?
Including California. I think California might be an addition. No, per country. It's $16,000 total. Some of the states you don't pay a penny. Some of the states it's $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. You add that all up, you get about $16,000 a year.
Okay, $16,000. Yeah. So I mean, but it's money, and
it's money. It's not huge, but it's money.
And for me, this is the way I look at it. It's kind of like the whole Apivar thing. We can make money. We can produce honey.
Hmm.
We can make bees. We can do those kind of things.
Yeah.
But when I pay my dollars for something, I need it to work.
Right.
And that's I think that's fair to ask. And so that and we don't have a lot of options, and that's what I want to unpack next, if we can, David.
Sure.
Is so we don't have a lot of we do have a variety of things, but there's limitations with everything. So right now, in
Hmm.
my personal arsenal, I have now included formic acid out of necessity to try to expand that, but I have to be very smart with it, and it's partially due to the urging of Tom Nolan to try some stuff,
Hmm.
and very reluctant, because the first time I used formic acid was in late August, and we did get a little bit of cooler weather, and the max were not as, in my opinion, consistent as the Formic Pro is.
That's
Um,
correct. The
so,
Formic Pro is a more is a better product exactly because it is a consistent product with a longer shelf life. The weird variability that you get in the Max, which was really the version 1 of the formic acid pads, is not worth the headache of sometimes it doesn't release enough, sometimes it releases too much.
whoops, yeah,
So
and
I really like the Formic Pro. It just does what it's supposed to do.
it seems to be a lot more consistent. So, Mite Away Quick Strips is what Max
Yeah.
stands for anyone who's wondering. And it's just way easier to say Max. And then the Formic Pro, both of these are made by the same company. It's Nod out of Canada. And so, because Apivar is now completely off the table for me, oxalic acid vapor, I don't even bother using it unless the colonies are almost broodless or completely broodless,
Right.
which limits me. So now we're literally talking Apiguard Thymol or some other Thymol products. So basically, I use Apiguard Thymol, I'll use Formic now limited, and I'll use oxalic acid vapor.
Yeah.
So that's an oxalic acid vapor really doesn't do that great unless you're willing to do tons of repeated treatments, and I'm not willing to do that. Let me tell you, doing those 5 rounds on 13 colonies in 15 days,
It
there's
becomes a
not a
full-time job.
yeah, there's no
Yeah.
way I am doing that over a couple hundred colonies,
Yeah.
and still with that, we did not even get close to 90% reduction
Hmm.
on the mites. Um, I'll have to look at the data to see where we were, but we were either upper 70s or low 80s, which was
Hmm.
better than I thought. But that was a monstrously high dose. We lost a lot of brood from that too. I really think it killed a lot of the young brood at that high of a dose, but I don't
Hmm.
have any proof of that. I just know I got spotty brood patterns, and it shut the queens down for a short period.
Hmm.
And so now the Apiguard Thymol, it's also sensitive to temperatures.
Yep.
So I think the path forward for me and probably everybody else on here, whether they want to admit it or not, is we've got to get smarter with what we have available currently. Because even if there is some cool things in the pipeline, this process is going to take a while. And we can't wait 5 years for the EPA and all the regulatory stuff in a company or however it goes to
Hmm.
fix things. We've been waiting for that. I've been in this 21 years. There's not been a lot of change in 21 years.
Hmm.
We're talking oxalic acid has been approved. Formic has gotten into Formic Pro, but ultimately there's not been any earth-shattering, revolutionary things that have just like,
Hmm.
oh my goodness, this is a wonder drug. So
Yep.
within what we have, David, what is something that's working up there for you New Yorkers that seems to be getting it done?
The organic acids are central to keeping the mites under control. Formic acid and oxalic acid are both critical tools. Um, in addition to those, the thymol-based products, as long as you're not running the risk of contaminating a honey flow with the odor of it, they work really nicely. And so you can use Apiguard. The other one is Apilife Var, and I'll do the same. I should have a big flashing light again. This is my financial conflict of interest. Betterby is also the exclusive distributor of Apilife Var
Huh,
in
didn't
the
know
U.S.
that.
So that came along with Apibioxal. So we took that one on. And if folks are thinking that I'm just out here to save money, go and look at the numbers. You can go on the Wayback Machine and type in, try to figure out the old prices, and you will find that when we took on distributing Apibioxal, we kept the price exactly the same. When we took on distributing Apilife Var, we knocked the price down. It is hugely cheaper per pack of Apilife Var. which is the other legal thymol product in addition to the Apiguard. They're both great. They're both really useful, and folks will prefer one or the other for certain times a year. Or, this one might work better on a little nuke. This one might work better on a big, strong colony. But they're both very, very effective miticides. And so really those three are sort of the mainstays for a lot of us and for a lot of the beekeepers we work with. Apivar strips are still very, very useful, and we find ourselves using them at the right time of year in the right hives. When we look at the situation, we say, what do we need to do? What's the temperature? What's the brood status? How important is it that this colony lives? What are the next couple of months going to look like? And we will absolutely use the Apivar strips. We'll use a HopGuard as well, which is the other legal miticide. All of these tools are good tools, but they're not all good tools at the right time of year. In fact, at any given point of year, I can point to one of them and say, that's the wrong miticide. So I think it's sort of like sports teams. Folks get in and somebody teaches them how to use Apivar strips or how to use Formic Pro, and they say, this is it. Oxalic acid, that's my miticide. I don't use anything else, and I never want to use anything else, and I don't even want to know about anything else. And unfortunately, you got to sit through the chemistry lecture. You got to figure out, how does this one work? How does that one work? You got to know all of them because, it's what I said. It's weapons in your arsenal.
Interesting.
So the approach is not this miticide is good and those are all crummy. The approach is we understand and have access to all of them, and then we make the correct choice at the time of year that we realize we need to do another treatment.
So I just actually looked on Better Bee while you're talking about that, because I haven't looked at Apilifar in a while. And I did the price on that, and it looks like it comes to $4.50 a hive. So if you buy 100 pack,
right,
and so which is quite a bit. I wonder if it's something that between now and Hive Life, if we could have maybe some of that brought down with you guys. Pre-orders. People do some pre-orders and that kind of stuff, because $4.50 for a hive treatment on my scale is actually pretty good.
The only thing cheaper is oxalic acid.
Oxalic acid, but I have to come
even
back a
legal
lot
stuff.
more.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's true. Yeah. Right. Right. And so that's our goal, is right. We look at the per hive treatment and we figure out what a reasonable beekeeper can afford to pay, and then we figure out whether or not we can, make enough money to keep the lights on and the doors open based on that price. But it's not about my policy is and has always been, and this is pretty well agreed to across Better Bee. I don't want to make money on a miticide. I don't want to make money on medicine. I want to sell you medicine for about as much as I paid for it, so that when your bees are thriving and surviving and you're calling me right now and saying, I don't know what to do. They all made it through the winter, but I ordered 2 packages and now I got to split them, but this one swarmed and I got to buy a lot more hives. Like, I'm happy making money selling you new hives. Right, I'm happy making money because you have a little 2-frame extractor and now you're going to go up to a 30-frame extractor. Like, that is a perfectly fine direction. But I don't want to make money selling you the miticide that keeps your bees from
So this
dying.
is a shameless plug for license equipment. Is that what this is?
Whatever it is.
Sure,
I'm happy making money selling classes to people, right? Because I feel good educating people. I don't feel good making a profit on a medicine. Right?
Sure. No, Varroa is something that we would like to one day not have to talk about near as much, and and it really holds our industry back significantly for all of us. It's not good for anybody that beekeepers are losing their hives. I guess maybe some people selling bees, but the way I argue that, though, because I've had some pushback from commercial guys telling us that guys like Ian and Bob and myself are a problem, because if we help people keep their bees alive, it's going to hurt the commercial industry on selling nukes and stuff like that.
The nuke and package market, right?
Yeah, the nuke and package market. I argue with that if people are successful, let's say, one of our guys over here, Michael Buck, is successful, and he decides that 10 hives with his full-time job is what he's going to do, and he's successful with that, and he's sustainable, and he's selling honey at his local co-op and wherever he's at, and people notice that kind of stuff. And then there's some other guys like, what, that dude's charging $10, $12 a pound for that honey. I'm not paying $10, $12 a pound. I'm going to go over to Better Bee, or I'm going to go somewhere, and I'm going to get some equipment. I'm going to buy a nuke.
Beekeeping doesn't look that hard.
Yeah, beekeeping doesn't look that hard. And so that's my argument, is if people are successful, more people will come into the industry.
Yeah.
And the bigger our industry is, the easier it is to get stuff,
Right.
because we make more money. I mean, and let's just be honest, the EPA, FDA, any organization, the wheels have to be greased, so to speak, for them to roll. But so there's a lot of questions. You may have already answered, but I was disconnected. But what treatment other than oxalic acid is not as hard on the bees, but is still very successful? Ooh.
Yeah. So, all right. Apivar is incredibly gentle on the bees. It's a synthetic miticide. Mites are arachnids. Bees are insects. It's something that's toxic to arachnids and not to insects. So Apivar, Amitraz, is a really, really gentle on the bees treatment. But it's got these resistance issues, and it breaks down. It doesn't stay in the combs, but it breaks down into stuff, and some of that stays in the combs. And so that's something that you've got to balance, in your own mind. The formic is more intense on the bees, but it's more intense on the mites too, because it's going to penetrate the brood caps. I think that for that specification, I would say that when it's not terribly hot outside, the Thymol products, Apiguard and Apilife Var, are useful, but you can't do that when you've got honey supers on, because you're going to get stinky, thyme smelling honey.
A little Listerine.
Hopguard 3 is also, a lot gentler on the bees, but it is not as effective against the mites. It's effective, it kills mites, but all these other miticides advertise 90% effective, 99% effective, 95% effective. And I think even in the literature, Hopguard is like 85%. We're really proud of that. So it's good. It's going to kill some of your mites. You would rather have some dead than none, but it's probably not going to solve your problem for the year. And that's the mindset that we really need to throw away, is this idea that, I used this miticide, I paid money for it, I put it on my bees, I'm going to pat myself on the back, I'm not going to check my mite levels anymore because I treated, and so it should be fine. Unfortunately, you don't get to do that with livestock. You've got to make sure that there still isn't a problem, or that you really had the effects that you hoped that you were going to have by putting in the treatment. So it's just a matter of staying on top of it. You check, you treat, you check, you treat, and you treat with whatever was the right treatment at the time of year, given the circumstances of that hive.
And that's why we literally have multiple things available at any given time. And we, Formic actually did a lot better for me this spring than I thought it would. We did have a cooler spring than we typically do, so it gave me more opportunities to use it. But I used it last late summer. We got some cooler weather, and I was able to throw some in. And then I talked to Tom, and he's like, hey, man, what about an early spring treatment? And I'm like, I've never done that before. Let's give it a shot. So we did. And you know what? I did lose a couple queens out of the bee yard that I ran it through. However, those colonies sucked. I mean, it was a 50-50 if they were going to make it. Anyways, they definitely weren't going to make honey production. I looked at it as one of those things, these hives need to be cleaned up anyways. I need to get a new queen in there anyways if I lose the queen. And that's where we also have to realize that there's more to it than just the mites. We have to keep young queens in our operation. We have to split. We have to use a lot of bee husbandry. Just controlling Varroa is not going to keep bees alive in your hives. It will definitely help, and I think it's one of the biggest problems that we have. But the Formic did really good, and so we're trying to evolve in how we think about what we can and cannot do down here. So, treating in March with Formic, or early April. We'll get some opportunities in April here in Tennessee. Some years we might not. When Laurel and I got married, April, oh gosh, I need to remember this. Chris, we're going to the commercial. But the 9th, that's right, April 9th. And so, and this is like 12 years ago. Yikes. So it was 93 degrees that day.
Yep.
And it was burning hot. The only negative thing I can say about Formic that we had with it, using it as a spring treatment, is that the bees continued to forage pollen. And we had great foraging weather. And our bees typically struggle with getting a little bit pollen bound already in late March, early April anyways, due to all the hardwoods that we have. And since the queen shut down for a short period because of the formic, they
That
weren't
pollen's
burnt.
not going anywhere.
Right, they weren't burning that bee bread and pollen up in the combs, and
Yep.
they brought more in.
Yep.
And we actually ended up having to go through most of them and pulling a frame of bee bread and sometimes two.
Hmm.
Now, what if we would have used a pollen trap prior to that
Right.
and collected pollen, and then now we have an
Now you've got
increased.
a new saleable product in addition to dealing with that beekeeping issue that was going to crop up.
Exactly, and I think
Yep.
so. This is how we're trying to mentally change our mindset to fix our problems, whilst maybe discovering a new income source. So, I think maybe in the South we need to consider formic acid a little bit more,
Yeah.
and but I think the name of the game, David, as you've already laid out, is don't let the mites build up in the first place to astronomically high levels. A lot of us are still geared to this mindset that they build up all throughout the year, and then we just need to do one significant knockback before they go into winter, and we're done.
Right.
And realistically, that doesn't work very good.
Right, right. Because all the damage that they do, all of the feeding that they're doing, all of the viruses they're transmitting and amplifying and spreading throughout the colony, that's just going to keep happening in those colonies, over the course of that buildup period. And then when you knock them down, it's too little, too late. You kill every single mite in the colony with that magic silver bullet miticide. If they've been spreading viruses, if all of your bees have deformed wing virus after you've killed all the mites, your bees are still going to die. And it's going to be the mites' fault, even though they're all dead. So yeah, knocking down is not the way to do it. It's keeping down that matters. It's continuous mite management and making sure that that population is as low as you can get it, without going crazy and putting your bees through chemical stress. Don't do 8 grams of oxalic acid every single day for the entire summer. You're not going to have a healthy colony either.
No, they don't. And that's it's stressful whenever you. It doesn't matter if you put an essential oil in there. If you throw some peppermint oil or thymol. And thymol is one of the most tested things that we've put into beehives. I think there's research I've seen going back 100 years on thymol, where beekeepers were starting to use that for like EFB and chalk brood, testing that out. And that has some stress, adds some stress to the colonies. All these things are about, does the stress that we put them through, are we getting more relief long term than the extra stress that we're introducing? And so going along those lines, David, I think one of the things that we can do to be successful is not just be smarter on when we use these things, but creating opportunities to use these things in combination with a brood break. So would you mind talking about that a little bit and what your thoughts are?
Yeah. So the idea of a brood break is that if you, without any miticides at all, if I introduce a brood break into my colony, if I cage my queen, let's say for a month, just take a 3-hole cage, pop her in there, she's going to be fed, but she's not going to be able to lay any eggs, then I'm going to wind up with a colony that has no brood, which means that the mites that we're trying to reproduce can't. They're going to be walking around on bees, fat, crossing their little mite legs, trying to lay their eggs, and they just can't find anywhere to go, and maybe a bee is going to bite her legs off and she gets killed. So we know that just a brood break can slightly reduce the mite population in your colony. But when we get into things like that, when we get into like a physical control and a chemical control, we can start to see synergy. We can start to see opportunities for those two miticide methods or those two mite control methods to sync up with each other and be more effective than any one method would be. So if I take a colony and I cage my queen, and I can cage her in a little, isolation single cage like that. I could put her in. We've got these single frame isolation cages that are made out of queen excluder, so the queen has full access to one frame, but she can't get away from it. That's the only frame she's got. So she's there, she's laying eggs, but at the end of however long I was going to cage her, once all the other brood in the colony have emerged, I can go take out that single frame she's been laying on, throw it in my freezer, get rid of it. She's ready to keep moving through the colony. She's been laying eggs continuously, so she'll just keep doing that. But now, when I hit them with an oxalic acid vaporization, even if it's in July, right in the middle of the year, they've got no brood. So instead of those mites being, totally protected and me having to hit them a whole bunch of times and still only getting moderate control, I might be able to do a hugely effective mite control right in the middle of the year and knock that mite population back down. So those sorts of synergies are the kinds of things we need to be looking at and testing and talking about, as beekeepers, figuring out, hey, I put my queen on a frame, but the frame was mostly drone brood. So she was filling it up with drone brood. The drone brood is more attractive to the mites, so the mites were preferentially going in anyway. Then that was the only capped brood in the colony, so I took that out and threw it away. So now we're killing all of those mites that were in there. Now we're going to hit them with an oxalic acid treatment, and that's what, 2 grams, 50 cents worth of oxalic acid, or maybe 4 grams once we get the dosage changed, right? It's $1 of oxalic acid, and now we've knocked our mites down to almost nothing. So is it going to solve mites for our apiary for the rest of the year? No, probably not. Other mites are going to survive. You're going to have mites from your neighbor's yard that get carried in by drifters or robbers. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a much more effective way than just caging the queen or just pulling out a frame of drone brood or just hitting them with oxalic acid in the middle of the summer. So those sorts of methods, I think we need to do more testing on. I've done some of that and I've seen good results, but I don't have the big, robust scientific data set to go out and say, this is what everybody should be doing. And even if I did that research, right, Better Bee allows me to do my own scientific research here when I've got the time. But if I did that experiment in my own home apiary and I published it, it wouldn't necessarily work in Florida. So we've got to have folks replicating, duplicating those experiments and making sure that it's going to work in different regions with different bees and different, weather patterns.
What we're finding works really good. Now, this is the 5th year that we'll be implementing this, and we're getting better at it each year, is making what I like to call smart splits.
Yep.
Because new bees, just like with any industry, if you're in the cattle industry with dairy or beef, eventually your milkers or your best cows for making more calves, they get old and they're not as good at milking and they're not as good as making calves. But they can live for many years. Bees and queens do not live for 10 years, or 20 years. A great queen might see 3 seasons. I mean, that would be just exceptional, especially around
6 was
here.
the longest I've ever seen, but
Right.
she wasn't thriving at the end of that 6-year run.
Right. The longest I've seen is one go into her 4th season, and she was doing a poor job the year before. She definitely wasn't making honey production. And obviously, our queens lay a lot longer than you all's up in New York. And so different locations. Honestly, expecting a queen to give you more than 2 full years of great production is asking a lot, especially over a big operation. And especially if you're in the South where the queens are wanting to lay 12 months out of the year too. So what we do is look at this as one of the best things that we can have is young queens. Research has shown that younger queens go into winter with a bigger winter cluster, so they have a better chance of survival. Also, if we're making up these new splits, we're breaking up the colony and exposing the mites. So what if we take all the capped brood over here, and we might be able to just get 95% of the capped brood because maybe there's just a tiny bit over here.
Right.
But we take 95% of the capped brood and we put it over here with a new queen. And what we can do is not put that queen in immediately. Let's make that split on a Monday, and then we're going to come back on the Saturday with the queen that we've purchased. And we're going to come back in on that Saturday. We're going to cut down any cells that they started themselves. And then we're going to let that queen be introduced into there. And that capped brood will have already started to emerge. And then there's going to be a window. We can treat that broodless. But then the other cool part is the side that we left with the old queen had almost no brood at all. And
so
we can
treat them right away.
Treat them right away. And these smart splits, I think we get our cake and eat it too as much as we possibly can.
But Cayman, there's a horrible cost that must be paid. Beekeepers have to learn how to do math.
No.
It's not hard math, but you got to sit there and count and go, wait, how long after, if you're an egg and you got capped, and if you emerge on this day, then when do I got, you got to sit and do it. You got to do the math.
You got to do the bee math, but it makes your treatments phenomenally more effective. And the more I research about what researchers have done about testing these products available, let's say it's Apiguard, it does not perform well in lower temperatures. If it really needs to be above the mid 70s for it to
Hmm.
perform good
Yep.
as daytime temperatures. And so, and this has been researched in Europe. This has been researched in the U.S. And even when it's in its best parameters, a lot of the research that I've seen on Apogard thymol, which we use,
Hmm.
you're not going to ever see 90% on average. It's very, very rare to see that.
Right.
I've actually never seen that in a research publication.
Hmm.
But so
So don't plan for 90%. Plan for what it can
exactly.
actually do.
Don't, and I think a lot of times we plan for the 90%. I know that I used to all the time,
Yeah.
well, because on the magazine of Better Bee, it says, the company says
Right.
on there that it'll do that. But
Right. I treated, that means there should be zero parasites in this hive, so I don't have to think about them for a couple of months. Nope, that's not
and
how it works.
and here we are. And so, this, we had a great overwintering, thankfully this year. We had a couple yards because of hive life we didn't treat as much as the others,
Hmm.
and we had significantly higher losses, but they received the same, same genetics, same feed schedules, good forage, very similar environment. They just didn't get the same level of treatment as the rest of them. And I had one yard that got an extra round of treatment over the others. I treated it with 4 different things, David, but I had extra Apivar that was going to expire on me. So I did
Sure.
oxalic
Why
acid in
not?
December. Why not? Just I don't want to waste it, and so it might not even helped. But regardless, I didn't lose a single colony in that yard.
Hmm.
And I was pulling brood in early March, like the first week of March in that yard, because all the bees were so robust.
Yeah.
And so we did oxalic acid vapor twice in December. We did as soon as we pulled the honey supers, we did Apogard thymol, and then we made our smart splits, and then we hit them again. We did a lot of those in like late July, early August. Um, and then I threw the Apivar strips in after that was done, just because they were there. Those are some darn good looking bees in that yard. And the mite loads, were so low the whole time.
Yeah.
Mites never had a chance.
Low to moderate mite levels is what you need if you want your bees to survive the winter. High mites, they're going to die. Low to moderate mites, they're going to survive. But if you want them to thrive, you really need as low as you can go. So every mite that you kill is a mite whose daughter and granddaughter and great granddaughter and great 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 granddaughters you're not going to have to be fighting. So there is a value to that spring mite management, that early summer, that midsummer, that late summer, that early fall, that mid fall, that late fall mite management. Heck, going out in the
Mm-hmm.
winter. We recommend that folks go out and do an oxalic vaporization or an oxalic dribble around Thanksgiving or around Christmas.
What's the
Because
temperature you would recommend for that, David?
generally, I'm looking for a day where my bees are going to be, if I'm doing either of those, either a vaporization or a dribble, I want them to be clustered. I don't want them to be in a tight cluster. So I'd love to be able to find one day where it's going to be, maybe 50 degrees, and the bees are going to be out, they're going to be moving, they're going to be starting to spread from one another, but I can still hit them all with the dribble, or I can still hit them all with that vapor. And so it's looking for that slightly warm day when they still have absolutely no brood in our area. Obviously, you guys might not have a total broodless period, but
We
still,
try to.
lowest brood you get, you're going to wind up with your best opportunity to hit with something that only kills those mites that are actually on the
So,
bees.
based off of what you've read, or maybe what you've seen, or both, what do you think is more effective for just a one-off treatment? Oxalic acid dribble or oxalic acid vapor on actually killing mites long term?
My understanding of the data is that really they are remarkably comparable in their effectiveness, and that's especially if your dosages are sort of keeping up with the best science. So if we're setting aside sort of what's the legal dose versus what's the dose that scientists are telling us should be written on that label, and we're
Mm-hmm.
updating the labels to keep up with that, just in terms of the effectiveness of those two methods, everything I've read tells us that dribbles and vaporization are pretty darn similar. The vaporizers are more expensive than a syringe to dribble.
Mm-hmm.
Which takes you longer to put onto your bees is really a matter of how you're dribbling and how you're vaporizing. It's maybe a toss-up there. There was some evidence that suggested that the bees that got multiple dribbles had slightly lower survival.
Yeah.
And that's probably because they were eating a little bit of the OA syrup, and then they were eating a little more, and then they were eating a little more. But it didn't kill the colony. It just meant that a bee that was supposed to live 65 days only lived 62 days or something like that. So it's not it's not as bad as I think people sometimes thought it was, and we sometimes look at dribble as like the baby method for OA, right? Oh yeah, you can dribble for a while, and then when you get brave and buy your respirator mask, you can go out and do the vaporization. They're both really good treatment methods, and I know some commercial guys who have switched back to dribble instead of vaporization because they're getting really good control that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think either of them is fine, and like any miticide, you do it, you test to see whether or not it actually knocks the mites down the way you thought it did, and then you decide whether or not it's the right method for you at that time of year with those mite loads.
I mean, I couldn't have said it any better. So Thomas Robinson says beekeeping is a 4-season activity. You're only as strong as your last season. I thought that was a really good comment. It's something that we've learned. A lot of the literature here in Tennessee, and I'm not blaming anybody, but when I got into beekeeping, it was a modge podge of information, and a lot of it was there's half of it was really bad and some of it was good. And it was very confusing, and I found that a lot of the stuff that we do that helps us be monstrously successful compared to where we were 15 years ago is because we aren't doing what a lot of the standard things that are still being taught. Like one of the things is only treat once a year, and we treat multiple times a year, and we find that works wonderful. And that might have worked back in 1995 or 1998 when a lot of this stuff was written for Tennessee beekeepers, but it's 2023 now, and so we've kind of gotten away from that. And this is still common, and I don't have a hard time being nice to people. I have a hard time not shooting the topic down very bluntly, because it's a bald-faced lie that should not persist, and I don't like playing the blame game because I used to do that a lot. There's always something to blame for my losses, and sometimes, hey, maybe there was a farmer that actually sprayed a pesticide. Things do happen, but 99% of how your bees are going to turn out, really, you're the biggest common denominator that they have. And so I look at myself as being responsible for these creatures that I'm taking care of. And when it comes to not just treating them, but also, the topic was wintering in Tennessee. I hear it so often that my bees froze out in Tennessee. We had a night that got down to 17 degrees Fahrenheit, and it killed my bees.
How could bees possibly have survived 17 degrees Fahrenheit?
That's right. Well, and of course,
Is Ian still on?
Yeah, Ian. Well, he's a cheater. He has that cold weather storage. He's not even a real Canadian anymore. Anyways, if he's on, I'm sure I'll hear something snarky here shortly. But as far as that goes, we had some December weather with that big cold snap that came through, and it was like a high of 3 degrees Fahrenheit this year. And of course, a lot of people blamed their losses on that. I had hundreds of colonies come out of that, and I've had a great season so far. We're blessed with a very good honey flow this year. The weather's cooperated. There was people telling me in December and January this year was already doomed to fail before it even started. And they were blaming the winter for all of their losses.
Yep.
And so I think we need to shift our focus less on finding things to blame and more what can I do to help. And that 4-season activity is what has helped save me, because now we don't look at winter as our Achilles heel. It's not here. Up in New York, Wisconsin laughs at 17 degrees. You guys actually have legitimate concerns when it comes to winter.
Right. There's a possibility that a Wisconsin bee could freeze to death. But
yeah, well, negative 50 with some wind chills that day,
right.
Negative 30. But our summers, our Julys, Augusts, and early Septembers, and I remember telling myself this over 10 years ago, if we could find a way to conquer summer and do well through summer, we will be successful in bees. And we finally figured it out. And Varroa was number one, and nutrition was number two, and also keeping some young queens was great. And so that was just trying to paint a little bit of a broad brush that we're talking Varroa mites here, but there's a lot more to this than just Varroa.
Yeah.
And here's a hard question, because I know you just love all these, David.
Go for
Um,
it.
how do you think places like Bee Weavers go treatment free for so long? There you go, David. That's all you.
So I know a lot of treatment-free beekeepers, and I know a smaller number of treatment-free beekeepers that I respect. And what I mean by that is there are some folks who are doing it in a very reasonable way. They are not treating, but they are keeping their mite levels under control. They're keeping disease under control. They have good survival. They are often, not exclusively, but they are often doing that by perpetually splitting their colonies, because splitting a colony introduces a brood break, and it's going to give those mites less of an opportunity to grow continuously. And so if you are a queen breeder or a nuke producer, in particular, and you're selling treatment-free nukes, treatment-free nukes, treatment-free nukes, treatment-free nukes, yeah, you can keep your bees alive that way if they're perpetually being split and they're never going through that long buildup period where the mite population can grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So I have met folks who sell treatment-free nukes, and their nukes are fine. Their nukes don't have mite problems. They've got mites, but they're not dying from them. But then when somebody puts those bees into a regular apiary and they start managing them in a double deep to produce a bunch of honey, they'll be dead within a year or two, and they'll be dead from mites. So I don't know anybody who's got a mite-proof bee. I'd really like to meet them. I'd really like to meet that bee, but I've never met one yet. So I think that a lot of, or some of the treatment-free beekeepers you encounter are because their business model and their beekeeping model includes some bee management that produces very little honey, but a whole lot of bees that they can sell and sort of export out of their operation. And it's, you know, it's not folks who are necessarily doing it in a sneaky way. So like I've talked to Kirk Webster in Vermont about this. Kirk Webster is a treatment-free beekeeper, and he sells lots of nukes, and he knows that the splitting is part of that process. He's trying to breed for more resistant bees, lower mite levels, but he recognizes that those splits are helping him in that management. So he won't tell you that he's got a mite-proof bee. He's going to tell you that he's doing what he thinks is the best strategy to produce more mite-resistant bees over time, or more mite-tolerant bees over time. So I think that's my main answer there, is that there are bad ways to be a treatment-free beekeeper, and I've met plenty of bad treatment-free beekeepers, but there are good ways to do it, or at least acceptable ways. Often you've got to know a lot in order to do it right. You've got to know a lot about mites. You've got to know a lot about bees. So what I often see is that when you're a treatment-free beekeeper because you don't like mites, you think they're gross, you think they're depressing because they kill your bees, and you don't want to think about them, and you just bury your head in the sand, you're not going to have a lot of success. But if you're a treatment-free beekeeper because you really understand mites and bees and pathogen-host interactions and so you know how you can breed your bees to become more mite-resistant over time, then you can have success. But it's a lot harder than just going and buying some oxalic acid or some, you know, Apolite var or some Apivar or some, you know, whatever you're picking up. Those miticides are the easy route for keeping your bees alive. The much harder method is being a really responsible treatment-free beekeeper. And even there, you're still going to have years where the mites get past you; they get out of control. So I don't have a lot of respect for. So I have plenty of respect for folks who say I want to minimize the unnecessary chemical stress that I put my bees through. I don't have a lot of respect for folks who expect a purity test and say, I'm a treatment-free beekeeper. They tattoo it on their forehead. Treatment-free beekeeper, never going to treat my bees. And so even when they watch their bees getting sick with mites and they know that they could grab a treatment, knock the mite level down, and then maybe try to be treatment-free the next year by tweaking this or tweaking that. If they are so locked into that philosophy of I will never treat or consider treating, I think they're tying one hand behind their back, and we owe it to our bees to do our best to keep them alive. And so I think that it's dangerous to label yourself as a treatment-free beekeeper instead of a I would prefer to treat as little as possible beekeeper while still achieving good bee health.
Really well said. It becomes and not all of them are like this, but there are some that are really more into the dogma than they are into the data. And It's just a matter of time. I hope it's not any time that I ever get to see, but if history repeats itself like it likes to do, there will be something new that comes into the United States that will cause our bees stress. And it might take a while for our bees to adjust to it. And if it's a really bad thing like Varroa, it might be just another stressor that we have to somehow learn how to live with. And our bees for a time might have to really suffer for it. So I think that whenever if there's bees out in a tree somewhere, that's a different story. But whenever you buy a dog or you have a horse or when you get a hive of bees, there's a certain degree of responsibility that comes with that. Just like my kids, I got to feed Jimmy. I know it costs a lot of money and it's breaking the budget, but you got to do it. And there's some really good points that you made there. David, you talked a little bit about some overwintered nukes that you guys, going off on a different subject, but there's been some people talking about that in the comments. And, we can overwinter nukes down here in the South. I don't see it near as much as we should, but some of these people are up north. And could you talk just a little bit about that? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure. So Better Bee, one of the products that we sell. We sell hives and we sell miticides, but we also sell bees. And so we are an active bee farm, beekeeping operation, and we produce hundreds of overwintered nukes every year that we get through the winter up here in upstate New York. So they get run through the ringer. The weak ones die, and then we keep the healthy ones alive. So we had, I was just saying, somewhere north of 90% survival for our overwintered nukes, which is pretty darn good. And I think that the advantage
really
of that for us is being able to obviously sell as many of them to folks who want to get these good northern adapted queens that are coming out of the breeding program that we have control over. But the other advantage of it is that it lets us manage these nukes to hugely increase the number of colonies that we've got going into spring, even without increasing the number of bees. Right? We can take one big, strong honey production colony, and we can break that down as long as we've got enough queen cells or mated queens into what, 4, 5, 6 overwintered nukes that we're going to get through the winter up here on a total of 8 frames. Right? They got 4 frames of honey down below, 4 frames of honey in a super up above. They're sharing a wall with one another in these double wall nuke boxes. And we had more than 90% of those survive. It's a lot easier to kill the mites in one of those colonies. It's a lot easier to deal with health issues like that when you're not also worried about contaminating honey that might get into your honey extractor and that you might accidentally sell at the farmer's market. And the colonies seem to do better, right? A small colony, a small nuke is not going to eat that much honey. And so you can actually feed them less honey over the winter and wind up with more colonies in spring. And so there's sort of a philosophy that a lot of beekeepers have of nukes being a tool that you use to increase the number of bees in your operation, right? Nukes are something you buy and then turn into hives and colonies that you really take care of. But I think that there's an oversight, and as you say, you guys can overwinter nukes just perfectly well. If you've got a small colony, you can desperately try to grow them. Maybe you catch a swarm in late July, right? You can desperately try to grow them to get them ready to get through the winter for you, or you can turn them into an overwintered nuke and keep them in a much smaller confines, and they might be ready to do that growth in spring that they weren't ready to do in August. So I think that there's a lot of potential there in nuke keeping alongside our production hives, and recognizing that you can keep bees in different ways. There are folks who keep bees in observation hives like this, right? I've got an observation hive that I've had alive all winter sitting behind me that they can come and go through the wall whenever the weather's good. But I can close that tube off and I can take them to elementary schools and to libraries and use them to give all the talks that I give. So because I've been keeping these bees in just 2 frames, I have learned a lot about how to manage colonies in a very different way than managing a big production colony through the winter outside. Right? 2 frames inside is going to be a thirsty colony. It's a colony that's reactive to warm weather, but it's not going to be the same as a colony that's sitting out there in the yard with a bunch of snow on top of it. So recognizing that just because you're good at one kind of colony keeping, hive keeping, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't different styles of beekeeping that might be useful for your own operation, I think is a kind of a blind spot for beekeepers that it's worthwhile for folks to consider.
So, so David, we've had you on for 2 hours, and there's a couple more things just real quick. I always enjoy our conversations, whether they're on here or over the phone or wherever, because I think you're a guy that likes to do things. And we were talking about Tom
Oh
earlier
yeah.
just a little bit. So a good old Tommy boy from up there in Canada. Um, but we appreciate you coming on and being very candid about this stuff, and I think you do a great job at Hive Life for us and all that kind of stuff. And is so two things. So first of all, if you wouldn't mind doing a quick rundown here at the end of the video for the people that have come on late on kind of this oxalic acid stuff, just kind of like the 3 or 4 minute version of where we're at
Okay.
on a few of these subjects, and then at the end of that, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to add on that? So
Okay.
there you go.
So, oxalic acid is a great miticide. There have been a couple of legal changes and legal developments with it. Number one, it became legal to use oxalic acid with honey supers on, and that is still true. And that didn't change. Nothing is morphed or altered. It is still perfectly fine and safe to use oxalic acid when you've got your supers on. The other thing that had changed was that in some states there were these moves and these steps that were being taken towards legalizing extended release oxalic acid pads. Unfortunately, well, it happened. The federal government, basically the EPA, stepped in and said, "We don't like the way you're doing this. We don't approve." And then all of the states basically said, "Well, we're not going to piss off Dad," and they pulled it. So it's now no longer legal in the U.S. to use that unless you have an individual experimental use permit, like folks like Randy Oliver or Cayman or folks like us at Betterby have. And so that's no longer available to beekeepers, but there are some developments in the pipeline. It's not going to be here in a month, but it might be here in a year or in a year and a half that you can go to the store and buy an extended release oxalic pad product or something like it. The sort of main take home that I was trying to emphasize here is there's a whole lot of bureaucracy, there's a whole lot of paperwork, there's a whole lot of fees that go into approving these miticides. But when you buy the legal miticide, when you use the stuff that has been approved, first of all, it's been tested. They're testing for toxins and arsenic and weird stuff that might get into the production of something that isn't intended for use in honeybees. But more importantly, us respecting those pesticide laws means that we aren't hypocrites when we ask EPA to enforce pesticide laws on the farmer next door. It also means that the beekeepers are paying the companies that are paying all of those fees to change and improve those laws. And one of the biggest examples is that science is telling us that we need to increase the dosage for oxalic acid vaporization, and we are in the process of filing that paperwork. We are in the process of getting those numbers organized and formalized, filed, the fees paid, so that we can actually change that legal dose. And so that when you go to your local bee club, you go to a place like Betterby, you go to a place like your local university, everyone's going to be telling you the same thing, which is now legally this is the dosage you should be using, because that is what we find to be more effective than using without at the dose that's currently legal, because of that's what's gone through the paperwork channel.
And so exciting news, not so exciting news, and that's just on the sponges extended release front. But you have some pretty interesting news on the vaporization front, and this person's question leads right into that.
Yep.
Can you use oxalic acid with honey supers on in
Yes,
the U.S.?
yes. Technically, you can only use apibioxal, and so that's that legal oxalic acid versus the illegal stuff that you can sometimes buy even from other beekeeping suppliers.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
But apibioxal, which is the only oxalic acid Betterby sells, is the legal product that you can safely and legally use. And it became legal to use with supers on, in part because these guys were footing the bill to get all that paperwork through.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you buy the illegal stuff on eBay because you can save 20 cents per hive or whatever it is that you're trying to save, sure, you can do it. You're breaking the law. You're potentially contaminating your honey, and you're not pushing the industry in the right direction. You're not contributing to this push to try to improve our ability to fight Varroa.
So, and then also you're working hard, and that's something I want to kind of point out is David's done a lot of paperwork and research and stuff to be able to contribute to this need for more understanding of what it's going to take to get new stuff and to understand what the laws are. And one of the things that we would like to have is it legalized to use more oxalic acid vapor at a given time. So right now it is still 1 gram per brood box, but what's it kind of look for the future on more?
It's probably going to be more like 2 grams per brood box. It is possible that it's going to be one draft piece of language that we've got, and we need to see if this will fly with EPA before we actually submit it, is 2 to 4 grams per brood box up to a maximum of 6 grams per hive. So what that means is that if I've got single deep brood boxes, then I can go ahead and use 4 grams. But if I've got a double deep, I could use 6. So it sort of it modulates just how much you can add. You're not going to get all the way up to 8 with that, but it lets you do a little bit more than 4. So
Sure.
it gives some wiggle room. The question is whether EPA will allow there to be wiggle room in that language, or if they need it to be a strict number, at which point, we're just going to have to work with the scientists to figure out what the best number is.
So here's another little channel that we can kind of discuss just slightly. I won't keep you on forever, I promise, David.
No, that's fine.
But
my wife and baby are already asleep, so it doesn't matter. I can stay up all night.
I love
But some
it.
of these poor people might have things they wanted to do this evening.
Well, I mean, they're here with us. I mean, they're crazy weirdos like we are.
No, I meant they might have good things to do, something productive.
Oh, something productive. Well, sounds like some of them are doing oxalic acid vapor treatments in Scotland while they're listening to you, David. I mean, that's hardcore
I'm
right
glad
there.
I can be. When I'm doing tedious stuff in the middle of the night, it's so great to be able to find something on YouTube that's worth listening to. So I'm glad that guy was getting entertained.
Yeah, entertained, maybe a little education, all that stuff.
As long as he's not getting distracted, don't breathe that stuff in.
Yeah.
Sorry, what's our tangent we're going on?
The tangent we're going on is, all right, so there is, I think, a need for more research into oxalic acid degradation. And when you're using a vaporizer or any given delivery, maybe it's a dribble, but instead of you're using this sugar syrup solution or whatever. But I personally, I would prefer to see more on the vaporization front. And I've talked to the fella who designed the Instant Vap, the battery-powered unit. Have you ever got to use one of those, David?
Yeah, I've played with some prototypes of a couple of battery-powered units.
The Instant Vap, I personally have seen all the technical inner workings of it and been kind of led down that rabbit hole. I think you wouldn't really enjoy talking to Janos if you never have. But one of his arguments is, delivery of the acid is also very important on how short of a period it's being heated and gets out of the tube.
Yep.
And I think it's an important question to ask: is what we're doing the best? Are we losing 10% of OA viability? Are we losing no percent? Are we losing 40%? And which his argument is with some devices out there, we're losing a significant amount of oxalic acid. I don't know if that's true, but these are important questions.
Yeah. And it's astonishing how many of these really fundamental questions haven't actually been answered yet. So one of the things, while we're filing this paperwork to increase the vaporization dosage, we are also going to be adding a note in the legal instructions that you need to use a thermostatically controlled vaporization device or a temperature controlled device. So it doesn't have to have a digital electric thermostat, but it's got to be something that is designed in a way to control that heating profile, right? How long and how much heat at what levels is going to appropriately vaporize without melting and degrading the oxalic. I know that Medhat Nasser in Canada and a couple of other folks, but Medhat is a great researcher. He is organizing and working on exactly that, and I think they've got recently got grant funding to study the degradation, study the degradation profile, and the ideal temperatures and sort of temperature ranges.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
So once that number exists, once we're able to come out and say this is the maximum temperature or the maximum heating profile, that can get added to the label as well. And we can say, hey, this is the safe, legal way to use oxalic. Don't go out there with a propane torch and start heating up your cup and trying to get it all to blow into the hive, because sure, yeah, it's going to turn into a gas and go into the bees, but is it going to be oxalic acid dihydrate that's going to effectively control Varroa populations?
And I
We
mean,
don't know yet.
it's a huge question because, I mean, for all we know, and this could be why we see such fluctuations between certain results on how many mites that we kill with OA, is are we all using the same devices, and are we using the same temperature with those same devices?
Right.
And this one's insulated, this one's not insulated, this one's a slow cook method, this one's a fast one. What is it? And if it was,
This manufacturer has really good quality control on their devices, but that one doesn't, which means that all of these perform the same, but those are a little bit variable. You never know what you're dealing with until you really sit down and study it.
and that's why I think it's vitally crucial that we bridge these gaps between practitioners, being the beekeeper, and the research community,
Yeah.
and the regulatory system. And we've got to find a way to make these relationships happen, and fight these deep paperwork battles,
Yep.
and to be able to get this stuff done, because we don't really know what's going on with some of this stuff. And that's my biggest concern, is like, if we could get 30% more effectiveness out of this 1 gram of oxalic acid, then we're literally getting another 30%, out
Right.
of what we're legally able to use. And
Maybe
so
we don't need to change the dose. We just need to change the application method so that dose is more effective.
sure. And so I
Right.
think there's a lot of important questions that need to be asked. And I've said this before to you in our conversations. I'll say it again here, is that I don't even know what I could do. But if there's anything that we can do, or Hive Life can do, whether it's monetary, or whether it is literally getting thousands of signatures to show whatever regulatory system or whoever, beekeepers are serious about seeing these
Yeah.
changes. We would gladly help where we can. And
I think expressing that need is one thing, and throwing your support behind the companies that are actually doing the right stuff, that are producing the high quality vaporizer, selling the miticides that are actually effective, is part of it. And a really big part is, to some extent, citizen science. It's what you said, right? We need beekeepers, researchers, and regulators to all be working effectively. I promise you, it's easier to get beekeepers and researchers to work together than it is regulators. They're sort of off in their own world, doing their own thing. They're not our enemies. They're just doing what they do. But if the beekeepers on a large scale are able to contribute high quality data to the researchers, it means that the researchers, the beekeepers, the companies that are making these products can bring all of that data to the regulators. And the bigger that data set is, the easier it is to convince them that something needs to change. So I think being organized and smart about what we're doing, and if everybody's going to go and try oxalic acid, shop towels, file the paperwork with your local state, figure out how you can get approved to have an experimental use permit, and then when you generate data, you can give it to me, and I can write it down in an Excel sheet with all the other data that I've got legally, right? Cayman, you've got an experimental use permit, which means you could send me all of your data, and I could attach that as a supporting document in some of the paperwork I'm filing with the EPA. But if your buddy down the street just saw what you were doing and decided he was going to make up some extended release oxalic pads and then use them, he's not legally going to be able to tell me what he did, because if the EPA says, hey, where did those data come from, I don't want to get that guy in trouble. So, following the annoying bureaucratic path, even though it's annoying, is sometimes really helpful, because it means that the data that we produce, we can lump together in a smart way and then use to beat the bureaucrats to death with.
Well, and honestly, what little I have explored in that realm, they don't want to do anything that could ever compromise them. They don't want to put their
Right.
necks out,
That's it.
and the squeaky wheel gets the grease typically plays here. You almost have to be more annoying than the potential problems that could cause from allowing this to happen. You
Mm-hmm.
just kind of got to get to the point where, like, okay, we've got to make this David Peck guy go away. He's just driving us nuts. And fine, we'll do it. And so there's a lot to it, and I kind of get it. If I from their angle, they don't even understand why why we need these things and all that kind of stuff, but it is an ongoing problem. So you know you gave us a great a couple of presentations at Hive Life this year, filled in the first year. I've already seen some requests and questions about your observation hive. We don't have time for that really tonight, but
Mm.
David, do you have anything anywhere about observation hives? That is something that's really tricky to do, and it's difficult, a lot harder than most people realize, and that
Yeah.
would be a really interesting discussion.
I mean, it wouldn't be a half bad lecture for you to have me give at Hive Life next year. So there's a possibility.
There is a possibility. Well, and we really enjoyed having Better Be. I got a lot of great feedback the year before. Of course, you came out and you had the smaller booth where you showed some stuff, and that was greatly appreciated. You guys taking a chance, and then this year you guys really brought all kinds of stuff, and that was really cool. I got a lot of really good feedback from people seeing you guys there. You guys have a lot of fans that are on my YouTube channel for Better Be products and stuff like that.
Yep.
Um,
I was a Better Be fan before I was a Better Be employee.
well,
So it's a nice company to love. What I'll tell you is I do not have an observation hive lecture or any well formalized information on it, but it's something that I want to develop. So if folks want me to come give a lecture to your local or your state bee club, you can reach out to me, and I will sometimes travel and do those or give them over Zoom. Better Bee has a YouTube channel that folks I encourage to subscribe to.
sure.
And we've got a newsletter that we put out monthly, and so all of those articles are saved on the website. That's just an archive of articles that I'm writing, our head beekeeper is writing, the owners are writing. And so all of that is where we would put out information on things like observation hives. Unfortunately, I don't have sort of the comprehensive David's Guide to Keeping an Obs Hive Alive over the course of the winter. But if there's enough pressure for it, then maybe I can justify taking a week and pulling all that stuff together.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease, Well, that does sound like a compelling topic. That's one thing that we'd like to expand into as Hive Life is to, you were there 2 years ago, and we only had one room to talk in, and so we were very limited on our options. And then this year we had 2 rooms, and I don't want to get to be a conference where we have 12 rooms going. I just really think that waters down the experience quite a bit. But we are growing, and where we're at right now, it does not really lend the opportunities for those subcategories of like observation hives that are really fascinating. And one of the other topics I would really like to see is have somebody or some bodies come in and talk about professional hive removals from houses. I think in certain areas of the country that is a big need, and it's also something that you need to be educated on because it's quite tricky, and
there's
so
a lot of
it'd be
expertise
great.
in it, but you've got to get the folks with the expertise to be able to communicate it clearly to others, right? And not everybody's going to want to watch a lecture on observation hives, but for the folks that do, for the folks who are saying, hey, I really like my bees, but the local school or the local library really wants me to come and show off something about beekeeping, there are few better tools than something like this. I can just open the door on the back of this, pop 2 frames in, take it down. Kids get a sticker every time they find the queen. It is a wonderful teaching device. But you got to learn how to keep it alive if you want to be doing those presentations in December.
I love observation hive. So my dad took me to Fall Creek Falls, which is a gorgeous state park down here, and I was 13. And that was the second time that I was exposed to bees. So the first time, I actually didn't see the hive up close, but I saw one at a distance, and I was probably 6 or 7. And then we went into a museum that had a kids museum, and it had a huge wall, and it had all these hexagons built in, and at the
Hmm.
bottom you could actually crawl into these hexagons, and behind it had these paintings of larvae
Uh-huh.
and bee bread and honey stores and all kinds of stuff and eggs and all that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And I remember that really stuck with me. And then at Fall Creek Falls at 13, I saw that observation hive, and that just floored me. And then I saw another observation hive a year later at 14. Got to taste real honey for the first time in my
Hmm.
life. 2 months later, I purchased 5 hives from a beekeeper, and here we are.
Yep. They're
Um,
they are so compelling. My wife will always tell the story about the time we went to Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, which is a sort of a reenactment 1800s village with all kinds of old buildings and blacksmiths and whatever. And they've got a little honey house and an observation hive and some historical beekeeping artifacts. And so we went there and we were standing and I started talking to her about what I was seeing. And then somebody else asked a question. And I started answering their questions. And then my wife got bored and wandered away. And she came back a half hour later, and I was giving lectures to all of these people. And as she was standing there, coming back, trying to figure out when we were going to leave, they said, what does it take to get a job here? And I was like, oh, I have no idea. I'm just a guy who really likes bees. But I accidentally turned into a museum docent because they're just so fun to sit there and look at. I look at them all day, and I can't get enough of them.
yeah, I'm really starting to get some envy on your observation hive envy,
Well,
but
Better Bee sells them,
better be
and other folks sell them too.
another
They're
shameless
just great.
plug. Um, I'm going to answer this question real quick. Any idea when Hive Life tickets will go on sale? I'm not 100% sure at this point. Last year we opened it up in June. I will be making some video announcements beforehand. Our bees are doing well, and that's right now our priority is trying to, keep them from swarming any more than they already have. And, we're giving back to the ecosystem.
Swarming is good, Cayman. If your bees swarm, it means you did everything right for them. They're happy, they're healthy, they're
Oh,
growing. The
yeah.
only thing you didn't do was suppress swarming.
Or make
But that's just
enough
one thing.
splits. Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right.
Well, I had a buddy of mine who caught some in a swarm trap, and he's like, I appreciate that, man. He's not too far away from me. It could be a totally different one, but
Mhm.
I don't know exactly when the tickets are going to go on sale, but we are looking to possibly have an extra day this year because the days are quite long, and so we're contemplating shaving off a little bit of time off of the 2 days, just a little bit, maybe one lecture's worth of time, putting those lectures onto an extra day, and then having a few additional lectures as well, and also just making it to where everything's not so rushed for the vendors, rushed for us as the folks that run it, and also more opportunities for more unique things. Man, everyone brought all kinds of cool stuff to Hive Life last year. The honey show was a lot of fun for me. I've never showed honey before, but I was really proud of all the stuff that people brought from all over the country and out of the country even. And that's really all Hive Life is meant to be, is of what our craft is in one location. And that's why I'm so interested in observation hives and all the subcategories, because those things really are special, and they shouldn't be forgotten. It should be shared, and it should be done as much as we can encourage people to do it. And David, I really appreciate you. Maybe as much as anything, I've praised you a lot. Wow, I mean
Yeah,
this is
it's getting embarrassing at this
it's
point.
getting embarrassing. But all of this to say that I've always appreciated your enthusiasm for bees. Not everybody in this industry who has a job is gung ho about things as you are, and the enthusiasm is infectious, and that's we like those kind of people at Hive Life, because I really think that's where a lot of our success comes from, is we invite people who just love bees and are curious to learn more. And so you are a great fit from the get go. So we really have appreciated you, and I got to say thanks to Rylan. Thanks so much again, Rylan, for helping us out, and everybody. Go and check David Peck out if you have a bee club that needs someone to give a lecture. I know David's a super busy guy. He's definitely going to be after this plug. But he does a really good job on Zoom meetings and whenever he can, I'm sure in person. So definitely give him a look as a speaker for your bee association. I'm sure he'll do a good job. David, we won't keep you on any longer. If you'll stick around with Chris and I, we've got just one or two things to talk about after
Sure.
this. But everyone, thanks for coming on tonight. We are probably going to have a live chat here coming up on the weekend, just general questions and answers. David, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing for us. Thanks for filling us in. And if you ever need anything, reach out.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.
Guys, we'll see
Good night,
you in the next
everybody.
video.